Hello everyone and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you are joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The night was supposed to be quiet, just like any other in the remote stretches of the park. But as the darkness swallowed the last hints of twilight, I had a strange, primal feeling that something was out there, hidden in the deep woods. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but even the brightest beam seemed to bounce off the shadows, unable to pierce whatever mystery was hiding beyond my reach. And then I saw it. Two eyes, glowing bright, unblinking, and focused right on me. Working as a park ranger, you get used to a lot of strange stuff. It's part of the job. You hear noises that seem unnatural, find things in the woods that just shouldn't be there, and sometimes you even run across people who are a lot stranger than the animals that share the forest with you. But there's always a way to explain things. At least, that's what I told myself. Until that night. My shift had started as usual, just a patrol around the more remote stretches of the forest. The air was crisp, with a chill that hinted the fall was beginning to settle in. The scent of pine mixed with the earthy musk of decaying leaves. And the only sounds were the gentle rustle of branches in the wind and the occasional crunch of my boots against the ground. It was comforting, that quiet isolation. I enjoyed those solitary nights when it was just me, the woods, and the starlight overhead. That night, I was following a familiar path that ran alongside a narrow creek. It was my favorite part of the park, mainly because of how serene it always seemed, the kind of quiet that settles in your bones and puts your mind at ease. I clicked off the radio on my shoulder, deciding that I'd rather let the quiet sink in for a bit. Besides, the sound of static and chatter just didn't belong in a place like this. I don't remember when the unease started. It wasn't like some sudden chill running down my spine, nor was it some clear sign that something was wrong. It was more like a slow trickle of discomfort, a sense that something was off. The deeper I walked into the woods, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves seemed to echo just a bit too loud. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a bit too far. I paused for a moment and swept my flashlight around. The beam flickered across the trunks of trees, catching glimpses of bark and bushes. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The kind of feeling you get when you know. You just know. You're not alone. Probably just a deer, I muttered, trying to shake off the nerves. It was an old habit, talking to myself. It made the solitude feel less lonely. I took a deep breath and continued along the path, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind, just my imagination. The first real indication that something was wrong came when I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual symphony of crickets, owls, and rustling leaves had faded into nothing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should have, each crunch of the fallen leaves like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Then I saw them, two eyes, reflecting the light from my flashlight. I froze. They were maybe 50 yards ahead, just beyond the edge of the creek where the trees grew thick and tangled. The eyes didn't move, they just stared at me, glowing faintly in the beam of my light. They were too high off the ground to be a deer, and the shape behind them was wrong. Too broad. Too still. I swallowed, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Who's there?" The eyes didn't blink. They didn't waver. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight fixed on the glowing orbs. The underbrush around them was thick, a mess of briars and low branches, but I could make out the shape, tall, unnaturally so, with a hunched posture that seemed to shift as I approached. Suddenly, the eyes moved. They shifted slightly to the left, then to the right, as if whatever it was were adjusting its stance. The way they moved, smooth, deliberate, made my stomach turn. It wasn't the erratic, darting movement of an animal caught in the light. It was different, calculated. My mouth went dry. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as my hands began to shake. "If someone's out there, you need to leave. This area is off limits," I shouted, my voice cracking. The eyes blinked once, slowly. Then they vanished. I strained my eyes, trying to see where they had gone, but there was nothing, just darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. The logical part of my brain told me it was just an animal, maybe a bear, maybe a coyote, but something deep inside me, some primal instinct, screamed at me to go. I turned, ready to head back to my truck, when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, reverberating from the shadows behind me. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, making every muscle in my body tense. I spun around, flashlight flicking across the trees, but there was nothing there. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the brush. Branches snapped, and leaves rustled as whatever it was drew nearer. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't think. I ran. My boots pounded against the dirt path, my flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. I stumbled over roots, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. Behind me, I could hear the sound of something following, heavy, deliberate footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. The path twisted and turned, and I followed it blindly, my only thought to get as far away from that thing as possible. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might go out entirely. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, the sense that whatever was chasing me was just beyond the edge of the light. My truck was parked at the edge of the trailhead, and when I saw the glint of metal through the trees, I nearly cried out in relief. I stumbled toward it, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. The growl came again, this time so close that I could feel it, a vibration that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. I threw myself against the side of the truck, my fingers finally closing around the keys. I yanked the door open and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I hit the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before finding traction. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I saw it, a tall, hunched figure standing at the edge of the trail, eyes glowing in the red glow of my taillights. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the lights of the small ranger station finally coming into view. I pulled into the lot, my heart still pounding, and sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling as I reached for the radio, switching it back on and calling in. "This is Ranger Jack," I said, my voice hoarse. I think I might need some backup out here." There was a pause on the other end, then a crackle of static. "Jack, you okay? What happened?" I swallowed, my eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the station's lights. "I don't know," I said finally, "but there's something out there, something big." Another pause. Then, "Stay put, Jack. We're on our way." I let out a shaky breath, leaning back against the seat. The forest around the station was quiet, the night once again filled with the soft sounds of crickets and the rustle of leaves. But that quiet no longer felt comforting. It felt like something was lurking just beyond it, hidden in the shadows, watching and waiting. That night, I stayed at the station until the sun began to rise, the first hints of dawn lighting up the edges of the forest. When the other rangers arrived, I tried to explain what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could I make them understand the way those eyes had stared at me, the way that growl had made my very bones shake? We went back to the trail later that morning, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual, just the quiet, empty woods, as if the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and as I stood there, staring into the shadows of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, whatever had been watching me, was still out there, hidden somewhere in the depths of the woods, waiting for the next time I'd be foolish enough to walk into its territory alone. Story 2. The cold settled in that evening, clinging to every surface and creeping into every breath I took. My partner, Michael, and I had been hiking for hours through the snowy wilderness when we finally stumbled upon the cabin, its worn wood and rusted hinges a beacon of warmth against the deepening frost. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving us in an eerie, muted twilight. There was no other option. We had to seek refuge inside. As soon as we crossed the threshold, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The air inside the cabin was heavy, almost suffocating, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The small windows were frosted over, and dust covered every surface. Michael, ever the optimist, gave me a grin and said, "Looks cozy enough, right?" He was trying to lighten the mood, but there was something about this place that made the hair on my neck stand up. We dropped our packs near the old wooden table, and Michael quickly set about trying to start a fire in the stone hearth. I wandered over to the far end of the cabin, where an old, worn door hung slightly ajar. Curiosity got the best of me, and I pushed it open, revealing a small room filled with splintered furniture, stacked haphazardly against the far wall. A strange marking caught my eye. Long, deep scratches gouged into the doorframe, as though something with sharp claws had tried to force its way inside. "Hey, come help me with this fire," Michael called from the other room. His voice snapped me out of the strange trance, and I let the door swing shut behind me as I hurried over to his side. We finally managed to coax a flame to life, and the warmth spread slowly, chasing away the chill that had settled into our bones. The flickering light filled the cabin, dancing across the walls and making the shadows seem to shift and writhe. We ate in relative silence, the wind howling outside and battering the fragile structure of the cabin. Michael tried to make conversation, but I found it hard to focus. My eyes kept drifting back to the door to that small room. I couldn't shake the feeling that those deep gouges were some kind of warning. Eventually, exhaustion from the day's hike got the best of us, and Michael rolled out his sleeping bag in front of the fire, drifting off almost immediately. I wasn't so lucky. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind as it whistled through the cracks in the walls. Every so often I thought I heard something else, a low creak or a distant thud. I told myself it was just the old cabin settling, or maybe a branch knocking against the window. But there was something too deliberate about the noise, too rhythmic. Then it happened. A soft thud, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the snow outside. I turned my head toward the window, straining to see through the frosted glass. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was cast in a dim, reddish glow. I could barely make out anything beyond the window, just the vague impression of movement, something shifting beyond the haze of frost. I held my breath, waiting. The dragging noise grew louder, moving closer to the cabin. I turned toward Michael, but he was still asleep, oblivious to the sounds that now seemed deafening in the stillness of the cabin. My heart was pounding, every instinct telling me that we were not alone out here. Suddenly, there was a loud thump, directly against the door to that back room. The sound echoed in the small space, and I bolted upright, my eyes wide. Michael stirred, mumbling something in his sleep, but he didn't wake up. The cabin was plunged into an unnatural silence, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, slowly, deliberately, the door creaked open. The hinges groaned, and a shadow spilled out across the floor, stretching toward the dying embers of the fire. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, unable to move, unable to look away. Something was there, standing just inside the doorway, tall, gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I fought the urge to scream, my body frozen with fear. The figure shifted slightly, and I saw it, those same long, deep scratches etched into its hands. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever had made those marks on the door was now inside with us. I reached out, my hand trembling as I shook Michael's shoulder. He stirred, blinking blearily up at me, and I pressed a finger to my lips, pointing toward the shadow in the doorway. His eyes followed my gaze, and I felt him stiffen beside me, his breath catching as he saw what I saw. For a long moment, none of us moved. The creature, Michael and I, were locked in a terrible, frozen tableau. The only sound was the wind, still howling outside, and the crackle of the dying fire. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. It turned, slipping back through the doorway into the dark room beyond. The door swung shut behind it with a soft click, and the cabin was once again plunged into silence. Michael and I sat there, staring at the door, neither of us daring to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Michael leaned toward me, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, my eyes never leaving that door. Slowly, carefully, we gathered our things, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric seemed to echo, and I held my breath, waiting for the door to open again. We managed to slip out of the cabin, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. The snow crunched under our boots as we moved away from the cabin, our eyes darting back and forth, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. We didn't stop moving until the cabin was far behind us, its dark silhouette swallowed by the trees. Only then did I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. Michael looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath our feet. I shook my head, unable to answer. There were no words for what we had seen, no way to make sense of it. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between us and that cabin as possible. We walked through the night, the cold biting at our faces, our hands numb despite the gloves. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees casting long shadows across the snow. Every so often, I thought I heard something behind us, a soft rustle, a faint thud. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just the darkness, stretching endlessly behind us. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we were exhausted, our legs aching, our bodies trembling from the cold. We finally stumbled upon a ranger outpost, its small wooden structure a sight for sore eyes. We banged on the door, and a bleary-eyed ranger answered, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he took in our appearance. We tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, frantic. The ranger gave us blankets, hot coffee, and listened as we recounted the events of the night. His brow furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with another ranger who had joined us, their expressions unreadable. When we finished, there was a long silence. The first ranger cleared his throat, his voice cautious. "There's been stories about that cabin. Locals say it's cursed. People who stay there sometimes, they see things, hear things." He hesitated, then added, "We usually tell folks to avoid it, especially in the winter." Michael and I exchanged a glance, the fear from the night before still fresh in our minds. We hadn't imagined it. Whatever we had seen, whatever had been in that cabin with us, it was real. We left the outpost later that day, the rangers offering us a ride back to town. As we drove away, I found myself looking back, my eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The cabin was out there, somewhere, hidden in the depths of the forest. And whatever lived there, whatever had watched us from the shadows, I knew it was still waiting, still watching. I knew one thing for certain: I would never set foot in those woods again. Story 3. The silence of the forest is something you don't notice until it's gone. That evening, I was hiking alone, just trying to clear my mind. The quiet had been comforting at first, a blanket of calm that drowned out the chaos of life. But when the crunch of my boots was the only sound, I realized something was wrong. The birds had stopped singing, the wind had died, and even the rustle of small critters had vanished. There was something about that sudden absence of sound that made me pause. I had grown up around forests. I knew the difference between normal quiet and the uneasy, unnatural kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I stood there, frozen in place, listening for anything, even the slightest sign of life. But there was nothing, just a thick, oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. Slow, deliberate, matching my own pace, like something or someone was mirroring my movements. A chill ran down my spine. I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the dense underbrush to my right. It was thick with shadows, the last light of the sun barely breaking through the leaves overhead. I couldn't see anything, but the footsteps continued, staying just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just an echo, maybe the sound of my own steps bouncing off the trees. But deep down, I knew better. The rational part of me insisted it was a deer, maybe a fox. But those steps were heavy, deliberate. I swallowed, adjusting the strap of my pack, and decided to keep moving. I picked up the pace, my boots crunching through the undergrowth, each step measured, careful. The footsteps followed. My heartbeat quickened, and I tried to ignore the sense of growing dread that twisted in my gut. I had hiked this trail dozens of times, knew every bend, every fallen tree. But that evening, it felt unfamiliar, like the forest had shifted, turned into something alien. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, tracked by eyes hidden just beyond the reach of my vision. After a few minutes, the trail curved, leading down into a small ravine where a narrow creek flowed. The sound of water was a welcome change, a reprieve from the silence that had enveloped me. I hurried down the slope, my eyes scanning the area, hoping to catch sight of whatever was following me. Nothing. Just the gnarled trees, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to one another. I made my way across the creek, stepping from stone to stone, the cold water splashing around my boots. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, thinking maybe I'd lost whatever was out there, that it was just an animal that had lost interest. But as I climbed the opposite bank, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. They hadn't stopped. They had simply waited. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, on the other side of the creek, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw a shape, tall, hulking, half hidden by the shadows. It stood there, motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline, a figure that seemed almost human but wrong somehow. Too big, too still. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the flashlight strapped to my belt. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dim light, illuminating the spot where the figure had been. Nothing, just the trees and the water, rippling in the fading light. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to take a step back, then another, my eyes never leaving the spot where I had seen it. "It's just your imagination," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I turned, forcing myself to move, my legs stiff, my steps awkward. I needed to get out of there. I needed to find my way back to the main trail, back to where there were other people, where the forest didn't feel so alive, so predatory. I moved quickly, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The footsteps had stopped again, but I knew it was still out there, knew it was still following me. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out what little light was left. Then I heard it. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, reverberating from somewhere behind me. My heart leaped into my throat, and I broke into a run, my boots slipping on the loose dirt and fallen leaves. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the brush, something big. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning with every step. The trail twisted and turned, and I followed it blindly, my only thought to get as far away from whatever was behind me as possible. I could hear it now, the heavy thud of its steps, the snap of branches as it forced its way through the undergrowth. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the batteries began to die. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding against the trail, the darkness closing in around me. I could feel it, the weight of its presence, the sense that it was right behind me, reaching out, ready to drag me down into the shadows. Suddenly, the trees parted, and I stumbled into a clearing, the sky above a deep, inky blue. I could see the faint glimmer of the ranger station's lights in the distance, a beacon of safety. I pushed myself toward it, my legs threatening to give out, my lungs burning with each breath. The growl came again, but this time it was distant, fading into the forest behind me. I reached the edge of the clearing, the lights of the station growing brighter, and I allowed myself a glance back. The tree line was dark, impenetrable, and for a moment, I thought I saw it, those same eyes, glowing faintly, watching me from the shadows. But then they were gone, swallowed by the night. I stumbled up the steps of the ranger station, banging on the door, my knuckles white with fear. It flew open, and a ranger stood there, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he saw me. I tried to explain, tried to tell him what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was look back toward the forest, my heart still pounding, the sense of dread still clinging to me like a second skin. He led me inside, gave me water, and listened as I tried to piece together what had happened. His brow furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with another ranger, their eyes dark with worry. They didn't dismiss me, didn't tell me it was just my imagination. Instead, they nodded, their faces grim. "You're not the first to see something out there," one of them said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the station's heater. "We've had reports before, people seeing something, hearing things. The forest isn't always as empty as it seems." I shivered, the warmth of the station doing little to chase away the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I looked out the window, back toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. I knew they were right. There was something out there, something that moved through the shadows, watching, waiting. And as I sat there, safe within the walls of the station, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was still out there. And it would always be out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, waiting for the next person foolish enough to venture too far, to listen to the silence, to follow the trail into the dark. Story 4. The day had started like any other. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder and a backpack filled with the essentials, snacks, water, and a few tools. The air was crisp, and the autumn leaves crunched underfoot, their colors vibrant even beneath the dim light filtering through the canopy. But as the morning drew on, I ran into someone who would change everything, an old hunter, emerging from the woods, his eyes wide with fear. I wasn't used to seeing many people out this far. Most folks stuck to the marked trails or the hunting zones closer to the park's main entrance. But this man, his clothes ragged and his skin weathered, looked like he had been here for a while. He waved at me, and I stopped, leaning my rifle against a tree as I approached. Something about his expression made my heart beat just a little faster. "You shouldn't be here," he said without preamble, his voice gravelly, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. He glanced over his shoulder, back towards the depths of the woods, and I noticed how his eyes darted nervously, scanning every shadow. He was jittery, like a deer who had caught wind of something stalking it. I tried to smile, reassure him that I knew what I was doing. "I've been hunting these woods for years," I said. "I know my way around." He shook his head, stepping closer. His hand gripped my arm, his fingers cold even through my jacket. "No, you don't understand," he whispered. "There's something out there, something that doesn't want us here. I've seen it. It's driving the animals away, and it's watching, always watching." A part of me wanted to dismiss him, wanted to laugh it off as just another local with a tall tale. But the fear in his eyes was real, and it was contagious. I found myself glancing around, my heart picking up speed. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind had stilled, the branches hanging limp, the leaves barely rustling. He let go of my arm and took a step back, shaking his head. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice firmer now, as if he had made a decision. "You should too, before it finds you." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, moving with a speed that seemed at odds with his appearance. I stood there for a moment, staring after him, my mind whirling. I told myself it was nothing, just some old man with too many stories and not enough sleep. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt it, the weight of the silence, the way the shadows seemed to deepen, the sense that I was no longer alone. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I had come here to hunt, and I wasn't about to let some stranger scare me off. I picked up my rifle, adjusted my backpack, and continued deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser, and I had to pick my way carefully to avoid the gnarled roots that seemed to claw at my boots. The deeper I went, the more the unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few steps, I would stop, turn, and scan the forest around me. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows, the occasional flicker of a leaf as it fell to the ground. I told myself I was imagining things, that the old hunter's words had gotten to me more than I cared to admit. But then I saw it, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my rifle coming up instinctively, my finger brushing against the trigger. There, between the trees, something moved. It was too quick for me to make out, just a blur of darkness slipping between the trunks. My pulse quickened, and I took a step forward, trying to catch another glimpse. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vastness of the forest. There was no answer, just the same thick silence, pressing in on me from all sides. I took another step, my eyes darting from tree to tree, my breath catching in my throat. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the ground, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I froze, my eyes wide, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. The growl came again, closer this time, a deep, guttural sound that spoke of something large, something dangerous. I turned, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get out of there. I moved quickly, my boots crunching over the fallen leaves, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees pressing closer, the shadows growing deeper. I could feel it now, the presence of something following me, moving just out of sight, always staying one step ahead. The old hunter's words echoed in my mind. "It's watching, always watching." I tried to push the fear down, tried to focus on the path ahead, but it was no use. My senses were on high alert, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard, my rifle slipping from my grasp. Pain shot through my knee, and I bit back a curse, scrambling to grab my gun. As I reached for it, I heard something behind me, a heavy step, the crunch of leaves beneath a weight far greater than mine. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, its shoulders hunched, its form half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Slowly, I got to my feet, my hands trembling as I picked up my rifle. I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure, my heart pounding in my ears. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its presence like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I took a step back, then another, my eyes never leaving the figure. It remained where it was, its head tilting slightly, as if curious. The growl came again, low and menacing, and I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I wanted to understand. I turned and ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The forest blurred around me, the trees a maze of dark shapes that seemed to shift and move, trying to trap me. I could hear it behind me, the heavy, deliberate steps, the growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The path ahead was a blur, my vision narrowing to a tunnel as I pushed myself harder, faster. I could see the break in the trees up ahead, the faint glimmer of sunlight filtering through. I forced myself toward it, my body aching, my heart pounding. The growl grew louder, closer, and I knew it was right behind me, could feel its presence like a shadow that refused to let go. I burst out of the trees, stumbling into the clearing where my truck was parked. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back, my eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. For a moment, I thought I saw it, a dark shape slipping back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The growl faded, swallowed by the forest, and the silence returned, thick and oppressive. I didn't waste any time. I started the engine, the roar of it breaking the silence, and I tore out of there, the tires skidding on the loose dirt. As I drove away, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that whatever had been in those woods was still out there, hidden, waiting. The old hunter had been right. There was something out there, something that didn't want us in its territory. And as I left the forest behind, the trees fading into the distance, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be coming back. Story 5. We had only planned for a peaceful walk by the lake, a simple evening to unwind. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the water with shades of gold and red. Jessica and I had laughed and talked as we wandered along the shoreline, letting the calm of the lake soothe our minds. It wasn't until we turned back that we saw them, those footprints, big and deep, trailing ours in the wet sand. At first, I thought they were ours. The soft light and the ripples of the water played tricks on my eyes, and I figured it was just a trick of the fading daylight. But Jessica paused, her smile fading as she leaned down to inspect the tracks. "These aren't ours, Matt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could hear the uncertainty in her tone. I crouched down beside her, squinting at the marks. They were huge, far bigger than anything that could be mistaken for human. The prints sank deep into the wet sand, each impression marked by thick, claw-like ridges. My chest tightened, a growing unease creeping over me as I looked back the way we had come. The footprints followed ours, right up to where we were standing, and then, nothing. No sign of them turning back. It was as if whatever had been following us had just vanished. Jessica glanced at me, her eyes wide. She didn't say anything, but I could see the question in her expression. I forced a smile, trying to keep things light. "Maybe it was just a bear," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow. Bears didn't walk this close to the lake, and they certainly didn't follow people like this. "We should go," Jessica said, her eyes darting around the darkening woods that lined the shore. The trees cast long, creeping shadows across the sand, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air had grown colder, and the comforting warmth of the evening sun was quickly fading, replaced by a chill that seemed to seep in from the water. We started walking, our pace quicker now, neither of us speaking. The silence between us was heavy, the only sound the crunch of sand beneath our shoes and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. My eyes kept drifting to the trees, the dark spaces between the trunks where the fading light barely reached. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a reminder that we were not alone. After a while, I glanced behind us. The footprints were still there, our own steps mingled with the deep, heavy impressions that trailed along the shore. They followed us, unwavering, each print perfectly aligned as if something was deliberately shadowing our path. My stomach twisted, and I fought the urge to tell Jessica to run, to leave everything behind and just sprint back to the car. I knew that panic would only make things worse. The trail curved ahead, leading us away from the lake and up a small rise where the trees grew thicker. I could see the outline of our car parked in the distance, the last light of the sun catching on the windshield. Relief surged through me, and I reached for Jessica's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Almost there," I said, forcing another smile. She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on something beyond me, her expression one of growing fear. "Matt," she whispered, her voice trembling. I turned, following her gaze, and my heart dropped into my stomach. There, at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, its shape almost blending with the dark trunks of the trees. For a moment, I thought it was a shadow, just a trick of the fading light. But then it moved, shifting slightly, its head tilting as if watching us. My breath caught in my throat, and I took an involuntary step back, pulling Jessica with me. The figure didn't move any closer. It just stood there, half hidden by the trees, its eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, locked on us. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the last of the daylight. The air around us grew colder still, and I felt Jessica's hand tighten around mine. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely a breath. We turned, our pace quickening, and I fought the urge to look back, to see if the figure was following. The car was only 100 yards away now, but it felt like miles. Every step seemed to take an eternity. The world around us narrowing to the sound of our footsteps and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Finally, we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, the metal slipping through my fingers. Jessica glanced back, her eyes wide with fear. "Hurry, Matt," she urged, her voice cracking. I managed to unlock the door, and we both scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. I started the engine, my eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. The shoreline was empty, the lake still and serene in the fading light. There was no sign of the figure, no movement among the trees. For a moment, I wondered if we had imagined it, if the fear and the growing darkness had played tricks on our minds. But as I put the car in gear and we pulled away, I caught sight of something in the mirror. A dark shape, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. My stomach clenched, and I pressed down on the accelerator, the tires kicking up sand as we sped away from the lake. Jessica didn't say anything, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. I reached over, placing my hand over hers, trying to offer some comfort, though I wasn't sure I believed my own reassurances. Whatever we had seen, whatever had followed us, it wasn't natural. And as the road wound away from the lake, the shadows lengthening around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that whatever had stood at the tree line was still there, somewhere, hidden in the growing darkness. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the lights of the town finally coming into view. Only then did I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, the tension slowly easing from my shoulders. Jessica turned to me, her eyes searching mine, and I forced a smile, though my hands still trembled on the wheel. "What do you think it was?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it was, I don't think it wanted us there." She nodded, her gaze drifting back to the road ahead. The silence between us was heavy, the unspoken fear lingering in the air. We both knew we wouldn't be going back to that lake, not ever. Some places, once touched by darkness, were best left alone. Story 6. It was supposed to be a quiet night, a simple sleepover to catch up after weeks apart. My friend Rick and I had decided to camp out in my car near the old lookout, a spot we used to go to when we wanted to get away from everything. The lookout had the best view of the valley below, with the city lights twinkling like stars. It had always been a place of good memories, but that night, it would become something else entirely. The wind had picked up as the evening wore on, shaking the branches of the pines around us. Rick and I were sitting in the car, wrapped in blankets, talking and laughing, our breath fogging up the windows. We had parked facing the valley, and from the passenger seat, Rick could see the lights stretching out into the distance. The air was cold, and we had turned off the engine hours ago, not wanting to waste gas. I remember the quiet of that night. It was a stillness that settled over everything, the kind of silence that made every little sound stand out. The creak of the car as we shifted in our seats, the faint rustling of leaves outside. We had just settled in, talking about old times, when we heard it. A soft thump, like something landing on the roof of the car. Rick and I froze, our conversation dying mid-sentence. We looked at each other, his eyes wide with confusion. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rick nodded, his face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "Probably just a branch," he said, but there was an edge to his voice, a tremor that told me he wasn't convinced. I wasn't either. The wind had stilled, and the trees outside were no longer swaying. Whatever had made that noise, it wasn't the wind. We sat there, straining to listen, our eyes flicking to the ceiling of the car as if we could somehow see through the metal. The silence stretched on, the weight of it pressing down on us. Then, another thump, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the roof. My heart was pounding now, every beat echoing in my ears. I glanced at Rick, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his phone as he turned on the flashlight. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice, and neither of us moved. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, a sound that set my teeth on edge. It moved from the center of the roof to the side, stopping directly above my window. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my skin prickling with unease. I reached out, locking the doors with a click that seemed too loud in the quiet. Rick swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the ceiling. "It's probably just an animal," he whispered, though the uncertainty in his voice made it clear he didn't believe it. I didn't either. The weight on the roof was heavy, too deliberate, and whatever it was, it didn't feel like an animal. Then, without warning, something slammed against the rear windshield. The car shook, and I let out a gasp, turning in my seat to look back. The darkness outside was absolute, the trees barely visible against the night sky. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up with a soft glow that did nothing to pierce the shadows beyond the glass. Rick's breathing was shallow, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. He turned in his seat, his flashlight pointed toward the back window, the beam trembling as it swept across the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty clearing, the trees, and the faint reflection of the car's interior on the glass. Then we saw it, a face, pale and gaunt, staring at us from just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was something wrong about them, something too dark, too empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the panic rising, my body frozen with fear. Rick swore under his breath, his hand shaking as he fumbled to turn off the flashlight. The darkness swallowed us again, and I could feel the tension in the car, the two of us barely daring to breathe. The silence was thick, oppressive, and I could feel the weight of that gaze, those eyes still watching us, even though I couldn't see them anymore. The roof creaked above us, the sound slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was shifting its weight. I glanced at Rick, his eyes wide with fear, and I knew we had to do something. We couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever this was to make its next move. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice trembling. Rick nodded, his hand reaching for the keys still in the ignition. He turned them, and for a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, the car shuddering as it tried to start. My heart pounded in my chest, my eyes darting to the windows, half expecting to see that face staring back at me. Then, with a roar, the engine came to life. Rick threw the car into reverse, the tires skidding on the loose dirt as we backed out of the clearing. The car jolted as we hit something, and I let out a gasp, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, just the darkness, the trees blurring as Rick spun the wheel, the headlights cutting through the night as we sped away from the lookout. My hands were still trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I looked over at Rick, his face pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. Neither of us spoke. The silence in the car broken only by the roar of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. As we reached the main road, I dared a glance in the side mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. But then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and I forced my eyes forward, my heart still pounding in my chest. We didn't stop driving until we were well away from the lookout, the lights of the city finally coming into view. Rick pulled over to the side of the road, his hands still shaking as he turned off the engine. We sat there for a moment, the two of us staring ahead, the events of the night replaying in my mind. "What the hell was that?" Rick finally said, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my mouth dry, my mind struggling to make sense of what we had seen. "I don't know," I whispered, "but whatever it wasn't human." Rick nodded, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. The fear in his expression mirrored my own, a silent acknowledgement that whatever had happened that night, we would never be able to explain it. The lookout, once a place of comfort and escape, had become something else entirely, a place touched by something dark, something that watched and waited. As we sat there, the city lights twinkling in the distance, I knew one thing for certain. We would never go back. Some places, once touched by fear, were better left behind. Story 7. It was supposed to be a game, an innocent bit of fun deep in the forest where no one could find us. Sarah and I were just two kids, trying to outdo each other, playing hide and seek in the woods behind our neighborhood. The forest was our playground, a place that felt endless and magical. But there are some places you shouldn't hide, and some voices you shouldn't follow. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the branches, painting the ground with dappled patches of golden light. Sarah was it, and I was crouched behind a thick, gnarled tree, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I could hear her calling for me, her voice echoing through the forest, and I stifled a laugh. She was far away, her voice distant, fading as she moved deeper into the woods. I waited, trying to be patient, trying to keep my breathing steady as the forest hummed around me. The smell of pine needles and damp earth filled the air, and I felt that familiar rush of adrenaline, the thrill of hiding, of outsmarting her. I peeked out from behind the tree, looking for any sign of movement. The woods were still, nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Then I heard it, my name, called softly from somewhere nearby. Tommy? It was Sarah's voice, but it sounded different, almost hollow, like it was struggling to find its way through the trees. I grinned, feeling a jolt of excitement. She must have doubled back, trying to trick me. I shifted slightly, preparing to move to a new hiding spot, something closer to the edge of the woods. "Tommy," she called again, closer this time. My grin faltered. There was something strange about the way she said it, a flatness, an emptiness that didn't belong in Sarah's voice. I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat. Something about it made my skin prickle. "Tommy, where are you?" Her voice echoed, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. I couldn't see her, couldn't make out where the sound was coming from, but it was insistent. I felt a knot form in my stomach, an unease that crept up my spine. I looked around, expecting to see her blonde hair bouncing through the trees, but there was no one. "Come on, Sarah," I called back, trying to sound brave, my voice cracking slightly. "I know you're trying to scare me." I waited, listening, the silence stretching, thick and heavy. Then, her voice again, a little softer, a little farther. "Tommy, come here." Something in me snapped, some instinct, some primal sense of wrongness. I pushed myself to my feet, my heart pounding as I started to move, keeping low, trying to stay hidden. I wanted to find Sarah, to see her, to make sure everything was okay. The forest seemed darker now, the sunlight weaker, the air colder. I moved quickly, my feet crunching on the fallen leaves, my eyes scanning the trees. "Tommy." Her voice was farther away now, deeper into the woods, and there was no mistaking it anymore. Something was wrong. My legs felt heavy, my breath coming in short gasps. I knew these woods. We had played here 100 times, and I had never felt like this before. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, turned into something unfamiliar, something hostile. I heard a rustle behind me, and I spun around, my eyes wide, expecting to see her. But it was just a rabbit, darting through the underbrush, disappearing into the shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, trying to focus. I needed to find Sarah, needed to get us out of here. I called her name again, my voice echoing, but there was no answer. Then I heard it. Laughter. Faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakably Sarah's. It drifted through the trees, coming from somewhere up ahead, and my heart twisted. It sounded wrong, like it was being forced, like someone else was making her laugh. I moved faster, weaving through the trees, my eyes darting left and right, searching for any sign of her. "Sarah!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving nothing but silence. I stood there, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. The forest was dark now, the shadows long and deep, and I realized I didn't know where I was anymore. The familiar paths and landmarks were gone, swallowed by the creeping dusk. "Tommy!" Her voice was right behind me, so close I could feel the breath on my neck. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was no one there, just trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, the leaves whispering secrets I couldn't understand. My legs gave way, and I fell to my knees, tears stinging my eyes. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Sarah, where are you?" The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating, and I could feel the tears spilling down my cheeks. I wanted to go home, wanted to be anywhere but here, but I couldn't leave without her. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her, a figure, small and slight, standing just beyond the edge of my vision, half hidden by the shadows. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly, her blonde hair catching the last of the dying light. Relief flooded through me, and I pushed myself to my feet, my voice breaking as I called her name. "Sarah!" She didn't move, didn't turn to look at me. She just stood there, her head cocked to the side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. Something in me was screaming to stop, to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. I had to reach her, had to get us out of there. I was only a few steps away when she finally turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was something wrong, something empty about the way she looked at me. Her mouth opened, and she spoke, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was hollow, echoing, like it was coming from deep within the earth. "Tommy, come with me." I stumbled back, my blood running cold, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't Sarah. It looked like her, moved like her, but it wasn't her. The figure took a step toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural, and I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the earth, my heart racing. The forest closed in around me, the branches clawing at my clothes, the roots trying to trip me, to pull me down. I could hear her behind me, hear the laughter, that awful hollow laughter that chased me through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to get away, had to escape whatever that thing was. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the trees began to thin, the shadows giving way to the soft glow of the setting sun. I burst out of the forest, stumbling into the open field that bordered my neighborhood, my chest heaving, my body trembling. I looked back, my eyes scanning the edge of the woods, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, dark and silent, the forest holding its secrets close. I collapsed onto the grass, tears streaming down my face, my body shaking with sobs. I called out for Sarah, my voice breaking, but there was no answer. The forest was quiet, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets, the wind rustling through the grass. She was gone, taken by whatever lived in those woods, whatever had worn her face and called my name. I never went back to those woods. They became a place of whispers, of shadows that moved where they shouldn't, a place where laughter and voices could lead you astray. I knew that whatever had taken Sarah was still out there, still waiting, and I would never give it the chance to take me too. Some games are meant to be left unfinished. Some places are meant to be left alone. Story 8. The night was dark and endless, and I had no business being on that trail. My flashlight flickered as I stumbled over uneven ground, my breath fogging up in the cold mountain air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that had no place in the wilderness. A scream, distant and desperate. I paused, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear if it would come again. I had been hiking for hours, trying to clear my head, trying to lose myself in the quiet of the woods. But the further I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The wind had a way of making the world seem alive, the way it rattled the branches, the way it seemed to whisper through the leaves. And now, the scream. It was unmistakable, not an animal, not a trick of the wind. It was a human voice, raw with fear. I stood still, my flashlight trembling in my hand, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I swallowed, forcing myself to move, to follow the sound. My instincts told me to turn back, to get away, but there was something about that scream that I couldn't ignore. Someone needed help, and I was the only one out there. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight there was. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, shifting shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. I could feel the chill of the night seeping into my bones, the cold making my fingers stiff as I gripped the flashlight. Another scream cut through the night, closer this time, and I felt my blood run cold. It was followed by a low, guttural noise, something that made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, my feet crunching on the fallen leaves, my breath coming in short gasps. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, the path narrowing until it felt like I was walking through a tunnel of shadows. The screams continued, each one more desperate, more frantic, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to focus, tried to keep my thoughts clear, but the fear was overwhelming, a growing sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I wanted to call out, to let whoever it was know that I was coming, but my voice caught in my throat, the words refusing to come. I rounded a bend in the trail, and the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the quiet pressing in, thick and oppressive. I paused, straining to hear, my flashlight sweeping across the underbrush. Nothing moved. The wind had died, the forest eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking, barely louder than a whisper. The darkness swallowed the sound, and I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes scanning the shadows. I could feel my heart pounding, my skin prickling with unease. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the cold seeping through my jacket, making me shiver. Then I saw it, a shape, hunched and twisted, crouched just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was impossible to make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the underbrush. My breath caught, and I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away, couldn't move, my feet rooted to the spot. The figure shifted, rising slowly, its movements unnatural, almost jerky, as if it were struggling to find its balance. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming, and I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands trembling. I tried to steady the light, to keep the figure in sight, but the darkness seemed to close in, the shadows shifting and swirling around me. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice barely a whisper. The figure turned, its head tilting slightly, and for the first time I could see its eyes, dark, hollow, staring at me with an emptiness that made my skin crawl. A cold dread washed over me, and I took another step back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. It moved toward me, slowly at first, then faster, its body jerking forward with a speed that made my stomach lurch. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the earth, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The forest blurred around me, the trees a dark, twisting mass that seemed to reach out, trying to pull me back. I could hear it behind me, the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The trail twisted and turned, and I followed it blindly, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks hidden beneath the fallen leaves, and I stumbled, nearly losing my footing. I caught myself, my hand scraping against the rough bark of a tree, the pain sharp and sudden. I pushed on, my flashlight flickering, the darkness pressing in, the cold biting at my skin. I burst into a small clearing, my feet skidding to a stop as I scanned the area, my chest heaving. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a pale light across the clearing, the trees standing like silent sentinels at its edges. I turned, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, my flashlight sweeping across the darkness. There was no sign of it, no movement, no sound, just the quiet of the forest, the wind rustling through the branches. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, my body trembling. The clearing felt wrong, the air thick with tension, the silence oppressive. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, I heard it. That low, guttural noise, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, making my skin crawl. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned, sprinting toward the other side of the clearing, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran. I could see the faint glow of the trailhead up ahead, the promise of safety, of escape. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed myself harder, the fear driving me forward. The sound followed, growing louder, closer, and I could feel it behind me, could feel its presence, the cold breath on my neck. I reached the trailhead, stumbling onto the gravel path, my chest heaving, my heart pounding. The lights of the ranger station were just ahead, a beacon in the darkness, and I ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I burst through the door of the station, slamming it shut behind me, my back pressing against the wood as I tried to catch my breath. The room was empty, the air warm, the hum of the heater a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive silence of the forest. I sank to the floor, my body trembling, tears stinging my eyes. I don't know how long I sat there, the darkness pressing in from beyond the walls, the memory of those eyes still fresh in my mind. I knew one thing for certain. I had heard someone screaming out there, someone who had needed help, but whatever I had found, whatever had followed me, wasn't human. Somewhere in those woods, something waited, something that could wear the voice of a desperate person, something that had watched me, chased me, and almost caught me. And as I sat there, the warmth of the station slowly seeping into my bones, I knew I would never step foot on that trail again. There are some cries for help you shouldn't answer. Some things that the forest keeps hidden, things that are best left alone.
Story 9. The cold hit me first, a biting wind that seemed to slice through every layer I had on. I pulled my jacket tighter, my breath clouding in front of me as I trudged through the snow. The sun was setting, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples, and I was still far from where I needed to be. The cabin, the one they said had been abandoned for decades, was my only hope for a place to rest that night. I had underestimated the distance.
The map showed the cabin sitting just off the main trail, a small marker in the middle of a white expanse. But in the growing darkness, with the wind picking up and the snow crunching beneath my boots, it felt like I had been walking for hours. The trees around me were gnarled and old, their branches bending under the weight of the snow, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional distant howl of the wind. When I finally spotted it, a small dark shape against the snow, relief washed over me. I pushed on, my legs aching from the effort, until I reached the door. The cabin was smaller than I expected, its roof sagging, its windows dark and empty. I knocked, out of habit more than anything else. There was no one here, and I knew it. The door creaked open under the pressure of my hand, the wood swollen from years of harsh winters. I set my pack down on the table and moved toward the fireplace, my fingers stiff and numb as I worked to get a fire started. The woodpile in the corner was dry, and soon enough, flames were licking up the chimney, casting a flickering orange light across the room. The warmth was immediate, and I let out a sigh of relief, rubbing my hands together as the chill began to ease. As I settled in, the room slowly filled with light and warmth, the shadows pulling back from the corners. I pulled out some jerky from my pack, chewing thoughtfully as I stared into the fire. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you acutely aware of every creak, every flicker of movement. That's when I noticed it, a sound, so faint I almost missed it. A soft rustling, like fabric against wood, coming from the corner of the room. I turned, my flashlight beam following my gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the cot, its thin mattress sagging in the middle, the blanket draped over it, dusty and threadbare. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, just the old cabin settling. But the unease had already taken root, a growing knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I finished my meal quickly, setting the wrapper aside, and moved to the cot, brushing off the dust before sitting down. It creaked under my weight, the sound too loud in the silence. I clicked off the flashlight, letting the firelight fill the room. My eyes drifted to the window, the darkness outside impenetrable, the wind howling softly as it whipped through the trees. I told myself I was safe here, that the stories were just that, stories. Tales of old trappers who had lived in these woods, of strange figures seen at dusk, shadows that moved where they shouldn't. I had heard them all, but I had never believed them. Until the rustling came again. This time, it was louder, unmistakable. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. The shadows seemed thicker there, darker, and as I watched, I thought I saw movement, a slow, deliberate shifting, like something trying to stay just out of sight. My mouth went dry, and I reached for my flashlight, the beam flickering as I turned it on, cutting through the darkness. The corner was empty, just the walls, rough-hewn logs stacked one on top of the other, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. But the feeling didn't go away. That sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I stood, the cot creaking as I pushed myself up, my flashlight scanning the room. The fire crackled, the light dancing across the walls, and I took a step toward the corner. My breath held tight in my chest. The beam flickered again, the light dimming for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw it. A figure, hunched and dark, its face hidden, standing in the corner. A gasp escaped my lips, and I stumbled back, the flashlight dropping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, the light bouncing off the walls, and for a moment, the room was chaos. Shadows leaping, the firelight flickering, my own breath loud in my ears. I scrambled for the flashlight, my fingers closing around it as I swung it back toward the corner. There was nothing there. The corner was empty, the shadows still once more. I stood there, my heart racing, my hands shaking as I tried to steady the light. The cabin was silent again, the only sound the crackling of the fire, the wind outside. I told myself it was my imagination, that the darkness and the cold were playing tricks on me, but the fear wouldn't leave, that cold, gnawing fear that something was there, something just out of sight. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the corner, until I reached the cot. I sat down, my flashlight still pointed at the far side of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The minutes ticked by, the fire slowly dying down, the shadows growing longer once more. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with that feeling, that sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved toward my pack, my eyes darting to the window, to the door, to the dark corners of the room. I had to leave. I couldn't spend the night here, not with whatever it was that seemed to be watching me. I grabbed my pack, slinging it over my shoulder, my flashlight still in my hand, the beam flickering as I moved to the door. I paused, my hand on the handle, my ears straining for any sound, any hint of movement. The cabin was silent. The wind had died down, the night outside still and dark. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pulled the door open. The cold air rushed in, biting at my face, and I stepped out into the snow, my flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear was too strong. The sense that if I turned, if I looked back at that cabin, I would see it again, that figure, standing in the corner, watching, waiting. I pushed on, my feet crunching through the snow, my breath coming in quick bursts, the cold seeping into my bones once more. The forest was dark, the trees towering above me, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I kept moving, my eyes focused on the trail ahead, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I walked. I could still feel it, that presence, that cold, unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. The cabin faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness, and I forced myself to keep going, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. The stories had been right. There was something in those woods, something that watched, something that waited. And as I walked, the night pressing in around me, I knew one thing for certain. I would never come back. Story 10. The first howl pierced the stillness of the valley, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. I paused mid-step, my hand instinctively tightening around my rifle, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the kind of howl you hear from a coyote, or even a wolf. It was deeper, more resonant, something that seemed to vibrate through the air, echoing off the surrounding mountains, lingering long after it had ended. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting over the shadows that had started to lengthen in the fading light. The forest seemed to swallow the last of the sun's glow, the darkness creeping in quicker than I was comfortable with. I had planned on being back at the cabin by now, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee, not standing here alone with the night pressing in around me. But the buck I had been tracking all day had led me further than I intended, and now the only thing that mattered was getting back before full dark. I took a deep breath, the cold mountain air stinging my lungs, and continued down the narrow trail that cut through the valley. The snow crunched under my boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the growing quiet. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to shake the unease that had settled there, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a lone wolf, or a coyote that had strayed from its pack. But deep down, I knew this was different. Another howl, closer this time, tore through the silence. My body went rigid, the sound reverberating in my chest, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint where it had come from, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the whole valley was alive with it. The shadows between the trees deepened, the dark spaces growing darker, and I could feel a prickling at the back of my neck, an instinctual warning that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to move, my boots crunching over the snow as I quickened my pace, my rifle held tight across my chest. The trail wound its way through the valley, the trees growing denser, their branches heavy with snow, their gnarled shapes casting long, twisted shadows. The light of the day had faded completely, and the only illumination came from the thin beam of my flashlight, bobbing with each hurried step. The wind picked up, rustling through the treetops, and I shivered, the cold biting through my jacket. Another howl sounded, this time followed by a rustling, the unmistakable noise of something moving through the underbrush, heavy and deliberate. I stopped, my flashlight swinging in the direction of the sound, my breath clouding in front of me. My heart pounded in my ears, the silence pressing in, broken only by the distant sound of something. No, someone, moving just beyond the edge of the light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking, the words barely more than a whisper. My own voice seemed foreign, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the valley. The rustling stopped, and I stood there, frozen, my eyes scanning the darkness, my finger tight on the trigger. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind and the distant groan of the trees. Then, slowly, deliberately, a figure emerged from the shadows, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted into the gloom. It was tall, its outline blurred by the darkness, but I could see its eyes reflecting the light, two pinpoints of brightness that seemed to bore into me. They were too high off the ground, too steady, and I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. My heart pounded, the cold sweat prickling my skin as I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure moved, stepping closer, and I could see it more clearly now, its shape all wrong, twisted, its limbs too long, its body hunched as if it were too large for itself. I swallowed, the fear gripping me, my instincts screaming at me to run, to put as much distance between myself and whatever this was. I took another step back, then another, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I turned and started to move quickly down the trail. My breath came in sharp gasps, the cold air burning my throat, my legs aching as I pushed myself faster. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, followed me, the snow crunching under its weight, keeping pace just out of sight. The trees closed in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and I ducked under them, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, showing only more trail, more snow, more shadows. I could feel it behind me, that presence, that thing that had watched me from the edge of the forest. The howl came again, closer now, almost deafening, and I felt my knees go weak, my body trembling. I stumbled, nearly falling, catching myself on a low branch, my rifle slipping from my grasp and falling into the snow. Panic surged through me, and I dropped to my knees, scrambling for it, my fingers numb, clumsy. The footsteps were louder now, the snow crunching with each step, and I could see the shadows shifting, moving, as if they had a life of their own. My hand closed around the rifle, and I pulled it to me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself up, turning to face whatever was there. The flashlight beam flickered, the light dimming, and for a moment I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing, its body hunched, its eyes reflecting the weak light. It tilted its head, watching me, and I could see its mouth opening. A low growl rumbling out, vibrating through the ground, through my bones. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the snow, my body aching, the weight of my pack pulling at my shoulders. The path twisted and turned, the trees crowding in, and I followed it blindly, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. I could hear it behind me, that thing, moving faster now, its steps heavy, unrelenting, the growl turning into a snarl that seemed to shake the very air. The cabin was just ahead, the small, dark shape against the white snow, and I pushed myself toward it, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I reached the door, throwing it open, slamming it shut behind me, the wood rattling in its frame. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, my flashlight falling from my hand as I pressed my back against the wall. The growling stopped. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, the crackle of the fire I had left burning in the hearth. I stared at the door, my eyes wide, my heart pounding in my ears. The cabin was silent, the shadows deep, the firelight flickering, casting long, twisted shapes across the walls. I waited, my body tense, every muscle aching, the fear still gripping me. The minutes passed, the silence stretching, the fire slowly dying down. I moved to the window, my hands shaking, pulling aside the curtain just enough to peer out. The clearing was empty, the snow untouched, the trees standing silent and dark, but I knew it was still out there. Somewhere in those woods, something was watching, waiting. I let the curtain fall back, stepping away from the window, the weight of the night pressing in on me. The stories had been right. There was something in these mountains, something that walked when the sun went down, something that howled in the darkness. And as I sat there, the fire slowly dying, the cold seeping back in, I knew one thing for certain. I was not alone. Story 11. The swamp had a way of swallowing sound, of turning everything into a damp, echoing murmur. I could hear my own breath, harsh and quick, blending with the buzz of the insects that clung to the humid air. The sun had set an hour ago, and now the only light came from the narrow beam of my headlamp, cutting through the thick, clinging fog. Somewhere out there, something had moved, something big enough to send ripples across the stagnant water, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The boat rocked gently beneath me, the quiet splash of water against the hull barely breaking the silence. I squinted into the darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust, my hand tightening around the paddle. The swamp was thick with shadows, the trees towering above me, their branches draped in long tendrils of Spanish moss that swayed in the breeze. The air was heavy, each breath an effort, as if the swamp itself was pressing down on me. I had come out here to check the traps, a simple enough task that I'd done countless times before. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, something that made my skin prickle, that made the familiar paths through the swamp seem alien, twisted. The light from my headlamp barely penetrated the darkness, the fog swallowing it up, and I found myself straining to see what lay ahead, my ears pricked for any sound that didn't belong. I paddled slowly, the boat gliding across the surface of the water, my eyes darting from side to side, searching the shadows. The swamp was alive with movement, the constant hum of insects, the distant croak of a bullfrog, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. But there was something else, too, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. I paused, the paddle hovering above the water, my headlamp casting a weak circle of light across the surface. The whispering grew louder, a rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees, carried on the fog. My pulse quickened, the unease growing in the pit of my stomach, and I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, trying to find the source of the sound. The beam of my headlamp caught movement, a ripple in the water just a few feet from the boat. I stared, my breath catching in my throat as the ripples grew, spreading out in concentric circles, the water churning as something moved beneath the surface. My heart pounded, the cold sweat beating on my forehead as I leaned forward, my eyes straining to see what lay beneath the murky water. Slowly, a shape began to emerge, rising up from the depths, the water streaming off it in dark rivulets. It was a figure, tall and thin, its skin pale, almost luminescent in the dim light. My breath caught, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the paddle, my instincts screaming at me to get away. The figure stood there, half submerged, its head tilting slightly, its eyes, black, empty, fixing on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I let out a gasp, the sound swallowed by the fog, and I pushed the paddle into the water, the boat lurching backward, the figure slipping out of the beam of my headlamp. My heart raced, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as I struggled to turn the boat, to put distance between me and whatever that was. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction, the words indistinct, echoing through the darkness. I paddled frantically, the boat cutting through the water, my headlamp bobbing with each stroke, casting wild, flickering shadows across the swamp. The figure was gone, but the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of the light, was overwhelming. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, and I could feel the panic rising, my hands shaking as I gripped the paddle. The boat scraped against something beneath the water, jolting to a sudden stop, and I nearly lost my balance, the paddle slipping from my grasp. I cursed, reaching for it, my fingers brushing against the wet wood just as something moved in the water beside me. I froze, my eyes widening as I saw it, a hand, pale and thin, reaching up from the depths, the fingers curling around the edge of the boat. A scream tore from my throat, and I scrambled backward, my hands slipping on the wet wood, my headlamp swinging wildly, the light cutting through the fog in erratic arcs. The hand gripped the boat, the fingers tightening, the wood creaking under the pressure. I could see it now, the figure rising up from the water, its face still hidden in shadow, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening. I kicked out, my foot connecting with the edge of the boat, and the figure slipped back into the water, the hand disappearing beneath the surface. I grabbed the paddle, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, and pushed off, the boat lurching forward, the water churning around me. I paddled as hard as I could, the whispers fading, the fog slowly thinning as I made my way back the way I had come. The trees loomed above me, their branches swaying in the breeze, the Spanish moss hanging like curtains, the darkness pressing in. I could see the lights of the cabin in the distance, a faint glow through the fog, and I paddled toward it, my arms aching, my heart pounding. The whispers had faded, but the sense of being watched, of something following me, lingered, a cold weight that pressed down on me. I reached the dock, the boat bumping against the wood, and I scrambled out, my legs trembling, my headlamp casting long shadows across the planks. I hurried up the path to the cabin, my breath coming in short gasps, the fear still gripping me, my skin cold and clammy. I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the empty room, and I locked it, my back pressing against the wood as I tried to catch my breath. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the small lantern I had left on the table, its glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. I moved to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled aside the curtain, my eyes scanning the swamp. The fog had thickened again, the trees barely visible, the water dark and still. There was no sign of the figure, no movement, no whispers, just the quiet of the swamp, the insects humming, the wind rustling through the trees. But I knew it was still out there, somewhere in the fog, in the dark waters of the swamp. It waited, watching. I let the curtain fall back, stepping away from the window, the fear still gnawing at the edges of my mind. The stories had been true. There was something in the swamp, something that moved through the water, something that whispered in the fog. And as I sat there, the lantern flickering, the darkness pressing in, I knew one thing for certain. I would never go back out there again. Some places were meant to be left alone. Story 12. The forest at night is supposed to be peaceful. It should be filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant rustling of small animals. Instead, all I hear now is silence, an unnaturally thick silence that presses on my ears and makes my skin crawl. Something is out there, something I can't see but I can certainly feel, and whatever it is, it's watching me. It all began with the radio crackling to life in the middle of a long, dull shift. "Jake, we got something weird over on the north side. Fresh tracks, big ones. You mind checking it out?" "Roger that," I responded, my voice calm even though I was grateful for something to do. The north side was quiet at this time of year. No hikers, no campers, just a thick expanse of forest that seemed endless. And this particular evening, I'd been fighting to stay awake. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, and a chill was already creeping through the trees. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped up my jacket, and hopped into the ranger truck, the old engine rumbling to life. The radio crackled again, this time with static and a half-audible warning from a colleague. I didn't catch all of it, but it sounded like something about unusual tracks, and be careful. I chuckled to myself. I'd seen my fair share of strange things in these woods, but nothing I couldn't handle. Plus, a set of odd tracks sounded like a break from the monotony of another lonely shift. I took the dirt road up to the north side, tires crunching on the gravel, the headlights carving a path through the growing darkness. The drive took me deeper into the forest, where the trees loomed tall and thick, crowding the edges of the road as if trying to swallow it whole. Eventually, I parked at a small clearing. It was eerily quiet, and I noticed the absence of even the usual nocturnal sounds. No chirping insects, no rustle of leaves, just silence. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I stepped out. The air was crisp, and my breath made puffs of fog that drifted and faded. I moved toward the spot where I was told to look, my boots crunching softly on the cold ground, each step echoing in the silence. It was then that I saw them, tracks, massive ones, bigger than any canine I'd ever seen. They sunk deep into the earth, spaced far apart like something big, heavy, and fast had been through. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the edges of the print. It was fresh, really fresh. The soil was still soft and damp. The shape was unmistakably canine, but far too large to belong to a wolf or even the biggest dog I could think of. Something about the tracks set my instincts on edge, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I stood up slowly, the beam of my flashlight darting out across the dense underbrush. There was nothing but shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the tree line. The stillness was unnerving. Not even the leaves were moving, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, there it was, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, gone almost as soon as I noticed it. I whipped my flashlight in that direction, catching only the tail end of something, a shape vanishing between the trees, faster than anything had the right to be. My heart gave a solid thump. A rational part of my brain tried to reason it away. Probably a bear, maybe a deer startled by my presence, but the unease deep in my gut kept growing. I took a deep breath, reminding myself I was a ranger. I was the one who people called when they were scared out here, and now I was scaring myself with shadows. The silence pressed in, an invisible weight, and the unease grew sharper, like a needle pricking the base of my spine. I forced myself to move, to keep following the tracks. They led away from the road, deeper into the woods, each print clear and unmistakable in the loose soil. The beam of my flashlight bounced as I walked, the light carving a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees, more tracks, and I stopped. I hadn't heard it at first, not consciously, but there was something there, a sound. It was faint, barely louder than a breath, but it was there. Footsteps, heavy ones, matching my own, each crunch of leaves and twigs just a beat after mine, echoing back at me like a twisted game of Simon Says. I turned again, the flashlight cutting a rapid arc. Nothing. The woods stood dark and indifferent, shadows pooling thick between the trees. My pulse quickened, each beat pounding in my ears as I strained to hear, was it still there? The steps had stopped the moment I stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the darkness. It was supposed to be a command, Shao, but it came out almost like a question. The forest swallowed the sound, and the silence returned, denser now, almost suffocating. Something was wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me, leave, get back to the truck. But I couldn't. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some weird noise scare me off. I took a step forward, and then another, the crunch of my boots deliberate and loud, daring whatever was out there to make itself known. A branch snapped to my left, sharp and sudden, the crack echoing through the quiet. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, catching a glimpse of something. A pair of eyes, reflecting the light back at me, high above the ground. Too high for a wolf, too high for anything I wanted to be dealing with tonight. My breath hitched, a chill racing down my spine. The eyes blinked, then disappeared, the shadows swallowing whatever creature they belonged to. I backed up a step, then another, my heart hammering now, my flashlight darting back and forth. The tracks, the silence, the feeling of being watched, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable conclusion. Something was hunting me. I turned and started back the way I had come, my pace quickening with each step. The footsteps returned, louder now, keeping pace with me. I resisted the urge to run, knowing that running might provoke whatever it was. Instead, I kept moving, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the flashlight beam jittering with my shaking hands. Another snap, closer this time, followed by a low growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I broke into a run then, my feet pounding the earth, the underbrush clawing at my legs. The growl turned into a snarl, a terrible sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight bobbed wildly, the beam flashing over trees and branches. My only thought to get back to the truck, to get out. I burst into the clearing, my eyes searching frantically for the truck. There it was. I lunged for the door, fumbling with the handle, my fingers slipping once, twice, before I yanked it open and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut just as something crashed into the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. For a heartbeat, there was silence again. The cab of the truck filled only with the sound of my ragged breathing. I grabbed the keys from my pocket, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped them. I jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it until the old engine roared to life, the headlights flaring on and illuminating. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood tall and still, and there was no sign of movement, no glowing eyes, no massive shadow, just an empty clearing and the forest beyond, dark and indifferent. I didn't wait. I slammed the truck into reverse, backing out of the clearing, my eyes darting between the mirrors and the tree line. The moment I hit the dirt road, I shifted into drive and floored it, the truck bouncing over the uneven terrain, the headlights casting long, jittery shadows ahead of me. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, the forest finally giving way to the familiar sight of the ranger station in the distance. I pulled in, parked, and sat there for a long moment, my hands still gripping the wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, then another, trying to steady myself. The radio crackled to life again, a familiar voice calling my name. "Jake, you copy? Everything all right out there?" I picked up the receiver, my voice hoarse. Yeah, I'm fine. Just some big tracks. Nothing to worry about." There was a pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle. "Copy that. Get yourself some coffee, man. You sound like you could use it." I managed a weak laugh, but it died quickly as I looked back out toward the dark forest. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me, even here, surrounded by the familiar safety of the station. I never found out what made those tracks, and I didn't go back to that part of the forest alone again. Whatever was out there, dogman, bear, something else, it wanted me to know that I was in its territory, and I was smart enough to take the hint. Some places, some things, aren't meant to be found. Story 13. The river always seemed like a place where time slowed down. The water moved steadily, smooth and unwavering, reflecting the dense, towering pines that lined the bank. Today, though, There was something different about it. I could feel it the moment we arrived, a heaviness in the air, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, like the forest was holding its breath. Emma and I had come out here with the others for a relaxing day of fishing. The north side of the river was quiet, remote, and we knew the trout ran thick here. It was the kind of place we could set up our lines, crack open a couple of beers, and just sit back as nature took over. Emma had already started unpacking the rods while the rest of the group unloaded snacks from the back of the old pickup truck. We settled near the riverbank, the sunlight filtering through the branches above, dappling everything with warmth. It should have been a perfect day, but that sense of unease wouldn't leave me. I watched the tree line, the far side of the river where the woods seemed deeper, darker. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying an earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil, but beneath that, something else, something off, like a faint, musky odor. "Hey, help me with this," Emma called, her voice pulling me back. She was struggling with a tangled fishing line, her expression already half amused and half annoyed. I moved over to help, taking the line from her and focusing on undoing the mess. As I worked, I couldn't help but glance up again, my gaze drifting back to the far side of the river. It was then that I saw it, a figure just at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. My breath caught, and I squinted, thinking it might have been a trick of the light. The figure was tall, impossibly so, covered in dark fur that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding woods. It stood still, watching, and I could just make out the shape of its head, the slope of its shoulders. I blinked, but it didn't move. It just stood there, like it was studying us, considering. "Jake, you all right?" Emma's voice startled me, and I flinched, dropping the fishing line. When I looked up again, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tried to force a smile. Yeah, I'm fine," I said, bending to pick up the line. "Just thought I saw something." She gave me a curious look, but she didn't press. We spent the next hour trying to fish, though I couldn't keep my focus. My eyes kept darting to the far side of the river, scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. The rest of the group was oblivious, laughing and talking, completely unaware of the tension coiling inside me. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water, and the unease only grew. It was then that we heard it, the distinct snap of a branch, loud and deliberate. The laughter stopped, everyone turning to look across the river. What was that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide. I didn't answer. I was already standing, my eyes fixed on the spot where the sound had come from. A figure moved between the trees, and this time, everyone saw it, tall, broad, moving with an eerie grace. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, too big for a human, too deliberate for an animal. "Is that a bear?" someone behind me murmured, but I knew it wasn't. It was walking upright, its strides too smooth, too natural. The musky odor I'd smelled earlier was back, stronger now, carrying on the wind as the figure moved closer to the riverbank. Panic gripped me, cold and sudden. "We need to go," I said, my voice low, urgent. "Now." No one argued. We scrambled to gather our things, shoving rods and coolers back into the truck with shaking hands. I kept glancing up, my eyes darting between the trees, catching glimpses of that dark figure as it moved, never rushing, just following, watching. Emma fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as she tried to unlock the truck. The moment the doors were open, we piled in, slamming them shut, the cab filled with the sound of our ragged breathing. Emma turned the key, the engine sputtering to life, and we backed away from the river, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching, lurching us forward. I looked back as we drove away, my eyes locked on the tree line. The figure had stopped at the edge of the river, standing still, watching us leave. It made no move to follow, but the feeling of its gaze lingered, heavy, oppressive, like a weight on my chest. We didn't speak as we drove back to town, the tension thick in the truck, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that whatever it wasn't something natural. It was something ancient, something that belonged to the forest, something that had let us know we weren't welcome. Somewhere deep in those woods, the forest still held its secrets, and we'd been too close to one of them. I knew I wouldn't be coming back to that river anytime soon. Some places were meant to stay wild, untouched, and some things were meant to be left unseen. Story 14. The mountains always had a way of making me feel small. They loomed above, indifferent and ancient, their peaks dusted with snow even in the spring. Today, I felt even smaller as I walked along the narrow trail with my brother, Jeff. There was something in the air, something wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. A chill that wasn't from the cold, and a silence that seemed to deepen with every step we took. Jeff was ahead of me, his backpack bouncing with each stride. He was always the adventurous one, always the first to suggest exploring the less beaten paths. "Come on, Matt," he called back, his voice echoing slightly. "The view from up here is going to be amazing." I tried to smile, tried to shake off the growing unease, but it clung to me, a whisper at the back of my mind. The higher we climbed, the less I could ignore it. Something was off. We stopped for a break, and that's when I first heard it. A voice, faint, calling our names. "Matt, Jeff?" It was distant, almost swallowed by the wind, and I glanced at my brother, expecting him to say something. He didn't seem to hear it, too busy adjusting his camera, oblivious to the way my eyes widened. The voice came again, this time a little closer, the tone oddly familiar, like someone we knew. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Hear what?" Jeff looked up, frowning. The mountains were quiet, except for the soft rush of the wind through the pines. I hesitated, straining my ears, but the voice had stopped. My skin prickled, and I turned, my gaze drifting to the dense tree line off the trail, a dark tangle of branches that seemed to stretch endlessly down the mountainside. I felt it then, a sharp tug of instinct, like something just out of sight was trying to draw me in. "Nothing," I muttered, shaking my head. Jeff just shrugged and started up the trail again, but I stayed still for a moment longer, staring into the trees. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable now, a prickle at the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the sensation, even as I hurried to catch up to my brother, the unease growing deeper, sinking into my bones. The sun dipped lower, the light softening to a dusky orange as we continued. Shadows stretched across the trail, and the voice returned, clearer this time, echoing through the woods. My name, my brother's name, repeated over and over, each call more insistent than the last. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Matt." It was Jeff's voice, but Jeff was right there, ahead of me, unaware, his back turned as he climbed. "Jeff," I called out, my voice trembling. He turned, eyebrows raised in question. Before I could respond, we both heard it, the voice calling again, "Matt, Jeff." And now he froze, the color draining from his face. "Who the hell is that?" Jeff whispered, his eyes darting to the tree line. The calls were coming from there, deep in the forest, where the light barely touched the ground and shadows pooled thick between the trunks. The voice was getting closer, clearer, and I could feel a wrongness in it now, a distortion, like something trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. "We need to go," I said, my voice cracking, panic rising like bile in my throat. "We need to get out of here." Jeff nodded, for once not questioning me, and we turned, hurrying back down the trail, our footsteps loud and hurried in the gathering dusk. The voice followed, calling, relentless, shifting in tone, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes almost laughing. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the rocks, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Matt, Jeff." The words twisted, like whoever, whatever it was savoring our names. I didn't dare look back. My legs burned as we ran, the air growing colder, the shadows closing in around us. The wind picked up, carrying that foul, rotten stench, a smell of decay that seemed to wrap itself around us, clinging to our clothes, our skin. Jeff stumbled, and I grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Keep moving," I gasped, my own fear pushing me forward. the weight of something unseen pressing against my back. The voice was closer now, almost at our ears, whispering, "Matt, Jeff," over and over, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. The trail twisted, and finally, I saw the break in the trees, the place where we'd started that morning, the sight of the parked car like a lifeline. I didn't let go of Jeff, pulling him along, not slowing until we reached the vehicle. We practically threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence, blessed, suffocating silence. Then, from the tree line, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the reach of the fading sunlight. Its shape was wrong, the limbs too long, the head cocked to one side, as if curious. The voice came again, but this time it didn't echo. It came from the figure, its mouth opening, the words spilling out in a grotesque imitation. "Matt, Jeff." I didn't wait. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and I hit the gas, the tires skidding on the gravel before catching. We sped away, the car bouncing over the uneven road, the figure disappearing into the distance, swallowed by the darkening forest. Neither of us spoke as we drove down the mountain, the weight of what we'd seen, what we'd heard, sinking in. It wasn't until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, that Jeff finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "What was that?" I shook my head, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. "But we're not going back." And I knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't just some trick of the wind or a voice carried by the mountains. It was something ancient, something that had lived in those woods long before we'd ever set foot there. Something that had seen us, known us, and called our names. Somewhere in those mountains, it still did. Story 15. The night shift as a ranger had its perks, the tranquility, the star-filled sky, and the peaceful solitude that came with patrolling empty trails. But there were also the times when the silence became too thick, too suffocating, when the shadows seemed to move just out of sight. Tonight was one of those nights, and as I drove through the winding dirt roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was unusually still, and the forest seemed to be watching me, waiting. I parked the truck by the old trailhead, stepping out into the cold, crisp air. My breath formed clouds in front of me, the only sign of life in the otherwise frozen night. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the edges of the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing unusual. I should have felt at ease, but instead, every instinct in my body screamed that I was not alone. There had been reports of strange sounds, low growls, something that sounded almost like a howl, but too deep, too guttural. Local hikers had claimed to have heard something moving in the woods at night, something large. They dismissed it as a bear, but I knew the bears didn't usually come this far down, not this time of year. And those tracks we'd found 2 days ago, massive paw prints, too big for any dog, they had left me uneasy ever since. I started down the trail, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent night. The flashlight's beam bounced as I walked, revealing nothing but more trees, the underbrush dense and unmoving. A chill ran down my spine, the kind that made every hair on my body stand up. I paused, listening. There, a noise, faint, somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't the snap of a branch or the rustle of an animal. It was breathing. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears, straining to hear. It was slow, heavy, the kind of breath that belonged to something large, something trying to remain quiet. I swung the flashlight forward, the beam trembling as I tried to steady my hand. My eyes scanned the forest, moving over the trunks, the branches, the shadows. Then I saw them, eyes, reflecting back at me from the darkness. They were high up, too high for any animal that should be in these woods, and they were fixed on me, unblinking. I froze, my mouth going dry, the light trembling as I held it on those eyes. They blinked once, slowly, and then they moved. The eyes lowered, and I saw the shape, a figure stepping out from behind the trees, moving on two legs, its form hulking and covered in thick, dark fur. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was massive, taller than any man, its shoulders broad, its head almost wolf-like, with pointed ears and a snout that curled into a snarl. The low growl reached me, vibrating through the ground, through my chest. My instincts kicked in, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. I turned and ran. I could hear it moving behind me, the heavy thud of its footsteps shaking the earth, the sound of branches snapping as it barreled through the underbrush. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster. The truck, my only thought, my only hope. I could hear it gaining on me, the growl growing louder, closer, a terrible sound that seemed to fill the entire forest. The truck was in sight, the trailhead just ahead. I dug deep, forcing myself to sprint the last few yards, my fingers already reaching for the keys in my pocket. I practically threw myself at the door, yanking it open and scrambling inside. I slammed the door shut just as something hit the side of the truck, the metal denting inward with a force that shook the entire vehicle. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands trembling so badly it took me 2 tries before I got it right. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before they caught, the truck lurching forward. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it, the creature standing there, its eyes glowing in the red of the taillights, its breath misting in the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached the station, my heart pounding, my mind racing. The image of that creature burned into my thoughts. I parked the truck, my hand still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. What had I just seen? It wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I'd ever heard of. A wolf, standing on 2 legs, intelligent eyes staring into mine. It was like something out of a nightmare. The radio crackled, a voice breaking through the static. "David, you copy? Everything all right out there?" I grabbed the receiver, my voice hoarse. "Yeah," I lied. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bear." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Copy that. Get some rest, man. You sound like you need it." I set the receiver down, my hands still shaking. I knew I wouldn't be getting any rest tonight. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done. It had let me go, but I knew. I knew it was still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I'd be lucky enough to get away next time. Story 16. Driving late at night on an empty rural road always made me feel a bit uneasy. It wasn't the dark, or even the silence, but rather the isolation. The feeling that anything could happen out here, far from the safety of town. Tonight, as I wound along the tight curves of the forested road, the headlights cut through the darkness, showing nothing but the seemingly endless stretch of asphalt and the dents on tall trees crowding in from both sides. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light that barely broke through the thick canopy overhead. I'd been driving for hours, the glow of the dashboard my only company, and my eyelids were starting to droop. I reached out to turn up the radio, hoping the music might keep me awake, when something darted across the road ahead. My foot slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the road, the woods, the shadows. Whatever it was gone. It had been fast, a blur of movement, but something about it had struck me as wrong. It wasn't the size of a deer or a bear, and the way it moved, almost on 2 legs but hunched, low to the ground, it didn't make any sense. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But as I reached for the gear shift, I caught a glimpse of something in the tree line, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring right at me. I froze, my fingers still hovering over the gear shift. The eyes blinked, and I realized they were higher off the ground than I expected. Too high for an animal, too level to be the eyes of a deer. They were watching me, unblinking, and my breath caught in my throat as the figure moved, stepping forward, into the beam of my headlights. What I saw made my blood run cold. It stood on 2 legs, hunched but towering, its body covered in dark, matted fur. Its head was canine, like a dog or a wolf, but with features that seemed off, distorted, its muzzle too long, its eyes too intelligent. It stared at me, its lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth, a snarl forming that I could hear even over the rumble of my engine. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my mind racing, my body frozen. I should have hit the gas, should have done anything but sit there staring back at it, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. The creature took a step closer, its muscles rippling beneath its fur, and then another step. It was getting closer, moving with a deliberate slowness, like it knew it had all the time in the world. Panic surged through me, and I finally snapped out of it. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the tires spinning for a moment before catching the car lurching forward. The creature's eyes widened, its snarl turning into something almost like a grin as it lunged toward the car. I swerved, narrowly avoiding it, my heart racing as I sped down the road, the trees blurring past on either side. I didn't dare look back. The road twisted and turned, and I took the curves too fast, the tires skimming the edges of the gravel shoulder, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The engine roared, and all I could think of was putting as much distance between myself and whatever that thing was as possible. A part of me hoped I'd imagined it, that it was just a shadow, some trick of the moonlight, my tired brain turning a stray animal into a monster. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it was real. It was something that shouldn't exist, something that had no place on this quiet, isolated road. And yet, it was out here, in the dark, and it had seen me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the glow of headlights in the distance. Another car approaching. Relief washed over me, and I honked my horn, flashing my brights to get their attention. The other car slowed, and I saw the driver's confused face as we passed each other. I didn't stop, couldn't stop. But seeing another person out here, knowing I wasn't completely alone, gave me enough courage to keep driving. I reached the edge of town a short while later, the lights of houses and street lamps a welcome sight after the darkness of the forest. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling as I parked, my breath finally beginning to steady. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were wide, my face pale, and I could see the fear etched across my features. What was that thing? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something else, something that belonged out there in the dark, away from people, away from the safety of civilization. I knew I'd never forget the way it had looked at me, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it seemed to enjoy my fear. I sat there for a long moment, the fluorescent lights of the gas station flickering above, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound. Finally, I turned the key, shutting it off, and leaned back in my seat, trying to calm myself. I knew I should tell someone, report it, warn others. But what would I say? Who would believe me? All I knew was that I wasn't taking that road again. Not at night, not ever. Whatever was out there, dogman, werewolf, whatever name people gave to creatures like that, it was real, and it was watching. And I had no intention of ever seeing it again. Story 17. Camping should have been a chance to escape the noise of life, to feel a little bit of peace under a sky filled with stars. At least, that's what I'd hoped for when we drove out to the edge of nowhere, miles away from cell towers and streetlights. The fire crackled between us, casting flickering light on our faces, and I could hear the wind rustling through the leaves, the far-off hoot of an owl. It felt almost perfect, until the night turned quiet, too quiet, like the entire forest was holding its breath. "Did you hear that?" Kevin asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. His eyes were wide, his head tilted to one side as if straining to catch a whisper of sound. The others, Sarah and Tom, fell silent, looking toward the trees, the flames between us snapping and popping, the only noise left. I leaned forward, trying to hear whatever Kevin had heard, but there was nothing. Just silence, thick and pressing. "Probably just an animal," I said, though my own voice felt wrong, too loud in the quiet that had settled over our camp. My heart pounded, and I could feel a chill prickling my skin despite the heat of the fire. The woods seemed darker now, the edges of our clearing swallowed by shadows, the trees looming like silent giants. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's too quiet," she murmured. "Where did all the sounds go?" She was right. The normal night noises were gone. The insects, the wind, even the owl. All of it had faded, leaving us sitting there with nothing but the sound of our own breathing. I glanced over at Tom, who was staring into the dark beyond the firelight, his jaw clenched. He was always the skeptic, always the one who laughed off ghost stories and spooky campfire tales. But now, even he looked uneasy. His eyes narrowed as he searched the darkness. "I don't like this," Kevin said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He stood, moving closer to the fire, as if the light could keep whatever was out there at bay. I could see his hands trembling, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. Then it happened, a sound, faint but unmistakable, a low grunt, deep and guttural, coming from the trees. We all froze, our eyes darting toward the source, the firelight suddenly feeling far too small, too fragile. My heart lurched in my chest, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but it didn't sound like a bear, and the longer I listened, the less it sounded like anything I wanted to encounter. "Maybe we should pack up," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide, and I could see the fear there, the way her gaze kept flicking from me to the trees and back again. I nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, let's—" Before I could finish, something moved. A shadow, large and hulking, shifted between the trees at the edge of our camp. It was just a glimpse, barely more than a flicker of movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I grabbed for the flashlight beside me, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the tree line. For a moment, there was nothing, just trees and darkness, the underbrush thick and tangled. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting the light, watching us from the shadows. They were higher off the ground than they should have been, and they didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I felt my stomach twist, a wave of nausea washing over me as I took a step back. "We need to go," I said, my voice cracking. The others saw it too. I could tell from the way they all reacted. Sarah gasping, Kevin cursing under his breath, Tom just standing there, frozen. "Get the stuff," Tom said finally, his voice strained. He moved toward the tent, his hands shaking as he started to grab at the gear, tossing it into a pile. The eyes blinked, and then the shadow moved. It stepped forward, into the dim light from the fire, and I felt my knees go weak. It was massive, covered in thick, dark fur, its shoulders broad and hunched. It moved like a man but wasn't one, its head too large, too animalistic, with a snout and sharp teeth that caught the firelight as it opened its mouth, a low growl rumbling out. Kevin dropped the lantern he'd been holding, the glass shattering, and we all moved at once, scrambling to get to the car. The creature snarled, and I heard it moving, the heavy thud of its steps as it followed us. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket, my breath coming in panicked gasps. Come on," I muttered, finally getting the key into the lock and yanking the door open. The others piled in, slamming the doors behind them, and I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I hit the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt for a moment before we lurched forward, the headlights illuminating the clearing as we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, the creature standing there just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching us leave. It didn't chase us, didn't move, just stood there, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It looked almost amused, like it had let us go, like it knew we'd be back, or maybe that it didn't need to follow. The forest was its home, and we were intruders who had been given a chance to leave. No one spoke as we drove, the only sound the rumble of the engine and our ragged breathing. My hands were shaking, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing. What had we seen? It wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could name. It was something else, something that belonged to the woods, something that had watched us from the shadows and decided to make itself known. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, the glow of distant streetlights finally breaking through the darkness. I pulled over, my hands still trembling as I put the car in park, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at the others, their faces pale, eyes wide, the fear still etched across their expressions. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head. "I don't know. But we're not going back." Tom let out a shaky breath, nodding. Yeah, no way." Kevin was silent, staring out the window at the dark forest beyond, his expression distant. I knew what he was feeling, the same thing I felt, the sense that we had seen something we weren't supposed to, something that belonged to a world we didn't understand, a world that was dark and old and filled with things that watched from the shadows. I turned the key again, the engine rumbling as I pulled back onto the road, the lights of the town ahead like a beacon, a promise of safety. Whatever was out there, it was behind us now, and I intended to keep it that way. Somewhere deep in the woods, that creature still roamed, still watched, and maybe waited. And as we drove away, I knew one thing for sure: I was never camping in those woods again. Story 18. The mountains have a way of making you feel both alive and terrified. Their towering peaks and deep valleys stretch on forever, and when you're there, in the middle of it all, you're just a speck in a vast wilderness. Today, as Laura and I climbed higher, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a clear day, and yet there was a strange heaviness in the air, like the forest around us was holding its breath. We had planned this climb for weeks. Laura, always the more adventurous one, had insisted we take the trail less traveled, the one that snaked up the side of the mountain through a dense patch of forest. She said we'd avoid the crowds, but as we climbed deeper into the woods, the only thing I wanted was to see another human face, any sign that we weren't completely alone up here. We stopped for a break near a small clearing where a cluster of boulders made a decent spot to sit and rest. Laura was busy adjusting her camera, trying to get the perfect shot of the mountain peaks in the distance. I was looking around, scanning the tree line, when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat, a collection of broken branches, piled together in an unnatural way. It looked deliberate, like something or someone had twisted and stacked them into a kind of barrier. "Hey, Laura," I called, my voice shaky. "Come check this out." She looked up from her camera, squinting against the sun, and wandered over. Her smile faded when she saw the twisted branches, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "That's weird," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think someone did that?" I shook my head, my stomach nodding. "I don't know. But it doesn't look like something that happened naturally." Laura knelt down, touching one of the branches, her fingers tracing the jagged breaks. "Maybe kids messing around." I frowned, looking around. "Out here? We're miles from the nearest trailhead. Who'd come all this way just to do something like this?" Laura stood, her eyes drifting to the forest beyond. She was about to say something when we heard it, a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a grunt. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. My blood ran cold, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, my eyes scanning the forest, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could swear I saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of something large, moving between the trees. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to get off this mountain." Laura hesitated, glancing at her camera, then back at me. She opened her mouth to protest, but the sound came again, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. That was enough for her. She nodded, quickly packing her camera into her bag as I grabbed my gear, my eyes never leaving the tree line. We started back down the trail, our pace quickening with every step. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful when we began, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in on us, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the path. The air felt heavier, each breath harder to draw. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling a prickle of fear that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Then, suddenly, there was a noise behind us, a loud snap, like a branch breaking under something heavy. We both froze, turning to look back. There, at the edge of the clearing, something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in thick, dark hair. It stood just beyond the reach of the sunlight, its outline blurred by the shadows, but I could see the glint of eyes staring at us, unblinking. "Oh my God," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. The creature took a step forward, and my heart leapt into my throat. It moved with an unsettling grace, its body shifting through the underbrush with barely a sound, its eyes never leaving us. It was then I realized this thing wasn't curious. It was stalking us. "Run," I breathed, my voice barely audible. I grabbed Laura's arm, pulling her along as we turned and bolted down the trail. My legs moved on instinct, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The trail twisted and turned, the ground uneven, rocks and roots threatening to trip us at every step. But I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The sound of heavy footsteps followed us, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the very earth beneath us. It was getting closer, and I could feel panic clawing at my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. Laura stumbled, and I reached out, grabbing her arm, pulling her upright, my own legs nearly giving out from the strain. "Come on, we have to keep moving," I shouted, my voice hoarse. We burst through the tree line, the dense forest giving way to an open slope that led down toward the distant parking lot. I could see the glint of my car in the distance, a tiny beacon of hope. But between us and the car was nothing but open ground, no cover, nowhere to hide. Laura looked back, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "It's still coming," she gasped, her voice cracking. I turned, just for a second, and saw it, the creature, now fully visible, standing at the edge of the forest. It was massive, its shoulders broad, its face partially obscured by the tangle of hair that hung down over its features. But I could see its eyes, and the way they locked onto us, calculating, predatory. "Go," I shouted, pushing Laura forward. We ran, our feet sliding on the loose dirt of the slope, gravity pulling us faster and faster toward the bottom. I didn't dare look back again. All I could do was run, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air, the car growing larger with every step. We reached it, and I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them out of my pocket. Laura yanked the door open, diving inside as I finally managed to unlock the driver's side. I threw myself into the seat, my hands trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it until the engine roared to life. The creature had reached the edge of the slope, its massive form silhouetted against the tree line. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us, and I could almost swear I saw something in its eyes, not rage, not anger, but something almost like disappointment. Then, slowly, it turned, disappearing back into the shadows of the forest, leaving us alone. I didn't wait to see if it would change its mind. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning for a moment before they caught, and we sped away, the mountain growing smaller in the rearview mirror. My hands were still shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. Laura was silent beside me, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Neither of us spoke as we drove, the weight of what we had seen, what we had barely escaped, hanging heavy between us. I knew, without a doubt, that we had seen something we weren't meant to, something ancient and wild that belonged to the mountain, to the deep woods, to a world we could never understand. Finally, Laura broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't tell anyone about this, can we?" I shook my head, my eyes locked on the road. "No one would believe us," I said, my voice hollow. "They'd think we were crazy." She nodded, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. "But we know." I glanced at her, and for a moment our eyes met, the fear still there, still raw. "Yeah," I said quietly. "We know." And as we left the mountain behind, the peaks fading into the distance, I knew one thing for certain: I was never going back. Some places, some things, were meant to be left alone, and whatever we had encountered on that mountain was one of them. It was a guardian, a reminder that we were trespassers in a world far older and far more dangerous than we could ever imagine. Somewhere, deep in those woods, it still watched, still waited, and I had no intention of ever giving it a reason to come after me again. Story 19. The crisp morning air filled my lungs as I moved through the forest, my rifle slung across my back, the ground beneath me crackling with each careful step. It was supposed to be a routine hunt, a quiet morning to clear my head and maybe bring back some venison. The sun was barely over the horizon, painting the forest in gold and shadow, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel dashed through the underbrush. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that only a deep, untouched part of the forest could bring. I had tracked deer through these woods countless times, enough to know the signs, to recognize every broken twig and tuft of fur for what it was. Today, though, something felt different. The signs were there, hoof marks in the damp soil, the gentle nibbled leaves where a deer had fed, but the air was different. There was a tension in it, something that made my gut tighten and my skin prickle. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I pressed on, my eyes scanning the trees, my senses tuned to every sound. And then I heard it, a snap, loud and deliberate, not the sound of a small animal, but something heavier. My head whipped around, my heart skipping a beat. It was coming from deeper in the woods, off the path I usually took, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly made my way toward the sound, each step careful, my hand resting on the strap of my rifle. The farther I moved from the path, the quieter the forest became. The birds stopped their morning songs, and even the wind seemed to die down, leaving the woods unnervingly still. It was as if everything was waiting, watching. The snap came again, louder this time, followed by a deep guttural grunt that made my stomach twist. I crouched low, trying to peer through the thick underbrush, and that's when I saw it, something large, moving between the trees. At first, I thought it might have been a bear, but the way it moved was wrong. It was upright, shifting with a grace that no bear could manage. My heart began to pound, my mouth going dry as I squinted, trying to make out the details. The figure was tall, its silhouette massive against the trunks of the trees, covered in thick, dark hair that almost blended into the shadows. I could see its head turning, as if searching, and then it stopped, its gaze locking on me. My breath caught in my throat. Two eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on me from across the clearing. It was as if it knew I was there, as if it had been expecting me. Slowly, it straightened, standing to its full height, and I felt my knees weaken. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, its shoulders broad, its chest heaving as it took a deep breath. The air around me seemed to thicken, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey the panicked commands my brain was screaming. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost as if it was curious, and took a step toward me. The ground seemed to shudder beneath its weight, and that was enough to snap me out of my stupor. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root, my hand scrambling for the rifle at my side. I didn't raise it. Some instinct deep inside me told me that it wouldn't matter, that firing at this thing would be the worst possible move. Instead, I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps heavy, deliberate, like it wasn't in any rush. It was toying with me, letting me know that no matter how fast I ran, it could catch me if it wanted. I burst back onto the main trail, my legs burning, my vision narrowing as adrenaline pumped through my veins. My truck was parked a mile away, down the winding trail that led out of the woods, and I didn't slow down, not even for a second. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel it, the weight of its gaze on my back, the sense that it was following me, unseen. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the lock. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine, and for a moment I just sat there, my eyes darting to the tree line, half expecting to see it step out of the woods, to see those dark eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. I put the truck in gear, my foot pressing down on the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away, my heart still pounding in my chest. As the distance between me and the woods grew, the fear began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. That thing, whatever it was, had let me go. It could have caught me if it wanted, could have done anything it wanted, and yet it hadn't. It had watched me, studied me, and then let me run. I knew, deep down, that I had seen something that wasn't meant to be seen. Something ancient, something that belonged to the deep, untouched parts of the forest. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. Who would believe me? They'd say it was a bear, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was just spooked by the isolation of the woods. But I knew better. I knew what I saw, and I knew that the forest was no longer the peaceful escape it had once been for me. Somewhere, deep in those woods, that creature was still there, still watching, and I had no intention of ever going back to find it. The next time I felt the urge to hunt, I chose a different place, far from the mountains, far from the shadows of those ancient trees. But even then, even miles away, I could still feel it. The memory of those eyes, the way they seemed to look right through me, as if they could see every fear, every thought. The mountains were vast, and they held secrets that people were never meant to uncover. And I had glimpsed one of those secrets, a reminder that there are places in this world where humans are not the apex predators, where something older and stronger still roams, hidden from sight. I drove away that morning, but a part of me stayed behind, lost in those woods, forever haunted by the memory of what I had seen. I knew I could never forget it, and I knew that no matter how far I ran, there were some things you just couldn't escape. The mountains were alive, and they had eyes, eyes that had watched me, measured me, and let me go. And that, more than anything, was what terrified me the most. Story 20. They say the forest has its own personality, a spirit almost. I never believed in any of that until the night I spent alone in Blackwood Forest. I'd hiked that area countless times, always enjoying the solitude, the thick blanket of trees that shut out the outside world. But this time, something felt wrong from the moment I set up camp. A silence settled over the forest that wasn't the comforting kind. It felt like the woods themselves were waiting, watching. The day had been uneventful, just me, my pack, and the crisp autumn air. I pitched my tent beside a small clearing, the kind of place that would usually feel perfect for a quiet night under the stars. As evening approached, I sat by my small campfire, cooking up some simple dinner, when I noticed the absence of the usual nighttime sounds. No rustling, no birds, no distant scurrying of little creatures. Just silence, heavy and unsettling. I tried to brush off the unease, poking at the fire with a stick, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle down. It was a primal feeling, a sense of being hunted that I couldn't explain. Then I heard it, a distant, hollow call, almost like a voice. It echoed through the trees, faint but distinct, and the sound sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. It wasn't an animal, that much I knew. It sounded almost human but off, stretched in a way that made my stomach twist. "Hello?" I called out, my voice uncertain, swallowed up by the trees. I didn't really expect a response. Who else would be out here, miles from the nearest town? The echo of my own voice seemed to linger, and then there was silence again. I tried to shake it off, convince myself it was the wind playing tricks, maybe carrying a sound from far away. But deep down, I felt that prickle of instinct, the one that tells you something is very, very wrong. As darkness fell, I could feel my sense of security slipping. I sat closer to the fire, its crackling the only sound cutting through the eerie quiet. I glanced at the edge of the clearing, where the trees crowded in, the firelight barely reaching the nearest trunks. That's when I saw it. Movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. I blinked, trying to focus, but there was nothing there, just the dark shapes of the forest. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the flashlight, the small comfort of its beam pushing back the encroaching night. I swept the light over the clearing, the beam catching on branches and leaves, the occasional flicker of movement that could have been anything. But the sense of being watched grew stronger, the air thickening with every passing second. Then came the sound again, that hollow, haunting call, Closer this time. My heart started to pound, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. It wasn't an echo. It was real, and it was moving toward me. The voice seemed to shift, almost like it was calling my name, but distorted, stretched and broken. I turned the flashlight toward the source, my hand trembling, the beam shaking as I tried to steady it. The light caught on something in the distance. Eyes. Two pale, reflective eyes, staring back at me from the shadows between the trees. They were too high off the ground to belong to an animal, too still to belong to anything natural. The breath caught in my chest, the light shaking violently as I stared back, unable to look away. The eyes blinked, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness as if they had never been there. A branch snapped, loud and sudden, like a gunshot in the silence. I jumped, the flashlight slipping from my grip and hitting the ground, the light flickering. I scrambled for it, my fingers shaking as I picked it up and tried to fix the beam. I could feel the adrenaline surging, my fight-or-flight instinct kicking in, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to get out of there. I stood, backing toward my tent, my eyes darting around the clearing. The fire was dying down, the wood turning to embers, and the darkness was creeping closer, swallowing the edges of the clearing. I could still feel it, the presence, the weight of those unseen eyes on me. It was like the forest itself was alive, like it was breathing, waiting for me to make a move. The voice came again, louder, almost right behind me. A twisted, guttural sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. I turned, the flashlight beam darting wildly, and for just a second, I saw it, a shape tall and gaunt, standing between the trees. Its limbs were too long, its posture twisted, its eyes reflecting the light as it stared at me. It wasn't human, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong here, something that was wrong. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I left the tent, the fire, everything behind, my only thought to get away, to put as much distance between me and whatever that thing was. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches clawing at my arms and face as I ran, the flashlight beam bouncing with every step. I could hear it behind me, the rustle of movement, the crack of branches breaking under something heavy. It was following, not running, just moving, keeping pace, as if it knew I couldn't escape. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The edge of the forest was a blur, the dark shapes of the trees giving way to open ground, the pale light of the moon reflecting off the surface of the lake I had passed earlier. I stumbled, nearly falling, but caught myself, pushing forward until I was out of the tree line, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I turned, the flashlight beam sweeping over the forest, the dark wall of trees standing silent and still. There was nothing there. No movement, no eyes, no twisted shape following me. Just the dark, endless forest, stretching out into the night. My breath came in short, painful bursts, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the tree line until I reached the water's edge. I stood there, shivering, the cold seeping through my clothes, my gaze fixed on the place I had just escaped from. The forest was silent again, the same heavy, unnatural silence that had settled over it before. I knew deep down that whatever I had seen, whatever had been out there, was still watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the water, the flashlight clutched in my hand, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The fear didn't fade, it only grew stronger, the realization sinking in that I had seen something that wasn't meant to be seen, something that didn't belong in this world. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I finally turned away, my legs weak, my body aching. I made my way back to the road, every step feeling like a victory, the forest behind me still and silent. I didn't look back. I couldn't. No one believed me when I told them. They said it was exhaustion, that I was seeing things, that the forest can play tricks on the mind. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that somewhere, deep in those woods, It was still there, still watching, still waiting. And I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back to Blackwood Forest. Not ever. Story 21. The creek near my uncle's old cabin was one of my favorite places to visit. It ran through a dense patch of forest, its clear water winding between mossy rocks, always cold no matter the season. I loved the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting everything in a golden glow, and the way the air smelled fresh and damp, like the earth itself was alive. But there was one summer evening that changed everything, that made me realize the forest wasn't as welcoming as I had always believed. It had been a hot day, the kind that makes the air thick and sticky, and I decided to head down to the creek to cool off before the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest was quiet, the usual songs of birds replaced by an odd stillness, but I tried to ignore it, focusing on the sound of my footsteps crunching over the dry leaves. I figured the heat had driven everything into hiding, and maybe the quiet was a blessing, a sign that I'd have the creek all to myself. I reached the water, dropping my pack on a smooth rock, the cool breeze off the creek a relief against my sunburned skin. Kneeling down, I cupped my hands in the water, letting the chill seep into my fingers. The silence was louder here, broken only by the soft gurgle of the creek, and it felt wrong somehow. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end, the unease prickling at the back of my mind, but I tried to shake it off. I had come here to relax, not to spook myself with childish fears. Then, as I dipped my hands into the water again, I heard it, a rustling sound from the other side of the creek. My head snapped up, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the dense tangle of underbrush, the long shadows growing darker as the sun sank lower. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the feeling in my gut said otherwise. "Hello?" I called, my voice carrying across the water, sounding small and uncertain. There was no response, just the wind shifting the leaves, the creek bubbling along as if nothing had happened. I swallowed, my eyes still darting across the forest, every instinct telling me I wasn't alone. Then, I saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I focused on the spot, squinting against the failing light. It was tall, taller than any person I'd expect to see out here. Its shape strange, hunched. It moved with a fluidity that made my skin crawl, stepping from behind one tree to another, always just out of sight. My heart started to pound, my body going rigid as I watched. It was moving closer, not directly toward me, but along the creek, as if it were stalking, staying hidden. I caught a glimpse of something. Fur, maybe. A flash of yellow eyes, reflecting the last of the sunlight. Panic surged through me, my fight-or-flight response kicking in hard. I backed away from the water, my hands shaking as I tried to grab my pack, my mind racing. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. The forest fell silent again, a thick, suffocating quiet that made my ears ring. I held my breath, listening, my eyes fixed on the opposite bank, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. And then, I saw it clearly, stepping out from the trees, its form fully visible in the fading light. It stood on two legs, covered in dark, matted fur, its head canine, almost like a wolf's, but wrong. The eyes were the worst part, too large, too intelligent, fixed on me with an intensity that made my knees weak. Its mouth opened, a low growl rumbling out, and I could see its teeth, long, yellowed, sharp. It was like every nightmare I'd ever had about monsters in the woods had suddenly come to life. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I turned and ran, scrambling up the bank, my feet slipping on the loose dirt, my hands grabbing at branches to pull myself up. I could hear it moving behind me, the heavy thud of its footsteps, the snap of branches breaking under its weight. It wasn't rushing, almost like it was toying with me, letting me know it could catch me if it wanted to. I reached the top of the bank, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs trembling as I ran. The cabin wasn't far, just a short sprint through the trees, but it felt like miles. I could hear it still, moving steadily behind me, that growl turning into something almost like a laugh, deep, resonant, filled with a kind of malice that made my chest tighten. I burst out of the trees into the clearing where the cabin stood, my eyes fixed on the door, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I stumbled up the steps, throwing myself at the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle before I finally got it open. I slammed it shut behind me, the old wood rattling in its frame, my back pressed against it as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, the same heavy, oppressive silence that had followed me from the creek. Then, I heard it, a soft thud, like something heavy stepping onto the porch. I held my breath, my eyes wide, staring at the door, the thin wood the only thing separating me from whatever was out there. A shadow passed by the window, and I felt my heart seize in my chest. The creature was there, just outside, its breath fogging the glass, its eyes peering in as if it knew I was trapped. I could see its silhouette, the massive, hunched form, the way it moved almost casually, like it had all the time in the world. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking, my mind racing. There was no way out, no way to fight it. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, an old fireplace poker, holding it in front of me like it would do anything against the thing outside. The growl came again, low and deep, vibrating through the walls, and I could see the door shaking as the creature pressed against it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The shadow moved away from the window, the growl fading into silence. I stood there, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, waiting for the next move. But there was nothing, just the wind outside, the creak of the old cabin settling. I stayed like that for hours, my back against the wall, the poker clutched in my hands, my eyes darting from the door to the windows, waiting, listening. But the creature never returned. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze, the birds slowly beginning to sing again. I didn't waste any time. As soon as it was light enough to see, I grabbed my things and left, my eyes scanning the tree line, every shadow making my heart skip a beat. I didn't stop until I reached the road, until I was in my car, driving away from that cabin, from that creek, from the thing that had watched me, followed me, let me go. I never went back. I told my uncle the cabin wasn't safe, that he should leave it, let the forest take it back. He laughed, said I was imagining things, but I knew. I knew what I had seen, what had followed me, what had watched me with those intelligent, predatory eyes. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. And somewhere, deep in those woods, that creature still roamed, still waited, and I had no intention of ever giving it a reason to come after me again. Story 22. The old mining trails weren't the kind of place anyone went after dark. My dad used to tell me stories about the mines, how men had gone down there and never come back, how the mountain seemed to swallow them whole. But I wasn't a kid anymore, and when the guys from work dared me to hike up there at night, I couldn't say no. I figured they'd think I was scared if I did, and there was no way I'd let them get the satisfaction. The air was cold as I made my way up the trail, my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dark. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of the light, the way every sound seemed to echo off the mountain's stone face. It was stupid, I knew, just my mind playing tricks. But the feeling that I was being watched wouldn't go away. I finally reached the old entrance to the mine, the heavy wooden beams framing a gaping black hole. The guys had joked about me going in, but I wasn't stupid. I wasn't about to step foot inside that place, not when the ground was unstable, the ceiling prone to collapsing. I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam swallowed up almost immediately. The air coming out of the mine was cold, stale, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rot. I turned, about to head back down the trail, when I heard it. A low growl, coming from somewhere deep in the mine. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun back, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to point it toward the sound. There was nothing, just the darkness, deep and impenetrable. I swallowed, my throat dry, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. the sound of air moving through the old tunnels. But then there was another noise, a scrape, like claws dragging over stone. My stomach twisted, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. It felt stupid as soon as I said it, like I was expecting some miner from 100 years ago to answer back. The darkness seemed to shift, and that's when I saw them, two eyes, reflecting the light back at me, deep in the mine. They were too high off the ground, too still, just staring. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. They blinked, slow and deliberate, and I heard the growl again, low and deep, echoing from the depths. I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, something moving, its footsteps heavy, too heavy to be human. My heart pounded in my chest, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I ran, the beam bouncing off the trees, the rocks, the shadows that seemed to close in around me. The trail twisted and turned to my chum, and I could hear whatever it was getting closer, the growl growing louder, more menacing. It wasn't in a rush, it didn't need to be. It knew these woods, knew every path, every rock, every place to hide. I could feel its eyes on me, the weight of that gaze pressing on my back, the sense that it was playing with me, like a cat with a mouse. I stumbled, nearly falling, my ankle twisting painfully as I caught myself on a low branch. I didn't stop, just pushed myself forward, every muscle screaming, the cold air burning in my lungs. I could see the faint glow of the parking lot ahead, the old metal gate that marked the trailhead, and I forced myself to run faster, my legs heavy, my body trembling. I reached the gate, practically throwing myself over it, hitting the ground on the other side and rolling to my feet. I looked back, my chest heaving, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. The trail was empty, the woods silent, the only sound my ragged breathing and the distant rustle of the wind in the trees. But I knew it was still there. I could feel it, just beyond the edge of the light, watching me, waiting. I turned, limping toward my car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. I finally managed to get the door open, collapsing inside and slamming it shut, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. For a long moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding, my eyes locked on the dark woods beyond the windshield. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness of the mountain and the dark shape of the mine entrance far above. I started the engine, the headlights flicking on, illuminating the empty trailhead, the old gate swaying slightly in the wind. I drove away, the road winding down the mountain, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back, didn't slow down until I was miles away, the dark shape of the mountain disappearing into the distance. I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone up there, that something had been in that mine, something that had watched me, followed me, let me go. I told the guys at work I'd made it up to the mine, that there was nothing to see, just a bunch of old wood and rocks. They laughed, said they knew I wouldn't find anything, that it was all just ghost stories. I laughed too, but it felt hollow, forced. I didn't tell them about the eyes, the growl, the feeling of being hunted. I didn't tell anyone. But I knew. And I knew I'd never go back up there again. The mountain had its secrets, and whatever lived in those dark tunnels wasn't something that wanted to be found. Somewhere, deep in the earth, it still waited, still watched. And I had no intention of ever giving it another reason to come after me. Story 23. The abandoned railroad had always been the place we went when we needed to feel alone. It stretched for miles, cutting a forgotten path through dense woods and empty fields, the tracks long rusted, the ties splintering beneath the weight of time. That night, I found myself there again, my flashlight bobbing in my hand, the beam barely cutting through the thick night air. I had thought it would be just like any other night, quiet, uneventful, but I was wrong. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your breath come out in thick, frosty clouds. I shivered, tucking my free hand deeper into my jacket pocket. the flashlight in my other hand swaying with every step I took along the gravel-strewn path. The railroad stretched ahead of me, a thin line of darkness leading into more darkness, the trees on either side standing like silent sentinels. The wind whispered through the branches, rattling the bare limbs, the sound echoing in the emptiness. I wasn't alone. At least, I wasn't supposed to be. My friend Danny had said he'd meet me at the old signal tower, the place we always went when we wanted to escape. It was our spot, a rusted skeleton of steel that loomed over the tracks, forgotten by time and the world around it. But as I neared the tower, the flashlight beam flickering over the weathered metal, I realized Danny wasn't there. I stopped, the beam of my flashlight catching on the graffiti scrawled across the base of the tower, the colors muted in the pale light. My breath misted in front of me, and I called out, my voice echoing off the steel, bouncing into the woods. Danny? Silence. The kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, heavy and unnatural, the wind dying down as if the world itself was holding its breath. A sense of unease settled over me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I scanned the tracks, the flashlight beam swinging from side to side, the darkness swallowing everything beyond its narrow reach. There was no sign of Danny, no sign that anyone had been here at all. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I took a step forward, my heart pounding just a little harder in my chest. I told myself he was probably running late, that he'd show up any minute, a grin on his face, ready to make some joke about me standing out here all alone. But as the minutes stretched on, the quiet deepening, that sense of unease grew, twisting in my gut, making my fingers tighten around the flashlight. I turned in a slow circle, the beam catching on the empty tracks, the woods, the old tower looming above me. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low, rhythmic thumping, coming from somewhere down the tracks, far off in the distance. My breath caught, my heart skipping a beat, and I squinted into the darkness, straining to see what lay beyond the reach of the light. The sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel the vibration of it beneath my feet, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to travel through the rails and into the ground. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, my eyes locked on the dark line of the railroad stretching away into the woods. The thumping grew louder still, almost a pounding now, and there was something about it that made my stomach twist, something wrong, something that sent a spike of fear through me. I turned, my flashlight beam flickering across the gravel, and started to move. My steps quickening as the sound seemed to grow in every direction, echoing off the trees, the steel, the night itself. I made it to the base of the signal tower, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, my fingers cold and stiff as they gripped the ladder. I glanced over my shoulder, my flashlight catching on the tracks, the woods beyond, but there was nothing there, just the empty night, the wind picking up again, rustling through the trees. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing, my hands trembling as I began to climb, each step of the ladder creaking beneath my weight. The higher I climbed, the further I could see, the light of my flashlight sweeping over the tracks, the woods, the fields beyond. The thumping had stopped, the silence settling back in, but the fear hadn't left. That gnawing sense that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting. I reached the top of the tower, pulling myself onto the small platform, the metal cold beneath my hands, the wind biting at my face. I stood there, staring out at the darkness, the flashlight beam dancing across the landscape, my breath fogging in the air. There was no sign of Danny, no sign of anything, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it, the sound, the feeling, the fear. But then, from somewhere far below, I heard it again. The thumping, slow, deliberate, a deep resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. My heart pounded in my chest, and I leaned over the edge of the platform, the flashlight beam sweeping across the ground below. The darkness seemed thicker now, the shadows deeper, and as I stared down at the tracks, I saw something move, a figure, half hidden in the shadows, standing between the rails. It was tall, its outline blurred by the darkness, but I could see its head tilting up, its eyes catching the light, two pinpoints of brightness that seemed to pierce through the night and lock onto me. A gasp escaped my lips, and I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering onto the platform. The beam spun wildly, the light flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the steel, and for a moment, I thought I saw it, the figure, climbing the ladder, its movement slow, deliberate, its eyes never leaving mine. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to the edge of the platform, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes darting from the ladder to the darkness below. The thumping was louder now, a deafening pulse that seemed to shake the very air, and I could feel the vibration of it beneath me, the metal of the tower rattling, the sound echoing through my bones. I had to get down. I had to get away. I grabbed the ladder, my hands slipping on the cold steel, my heart pounding in my ears as I began to descend, each step a desperate rush, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The wind howled through the structure, the cold biting at my skin, and I could hear the thumping louder, closer, as if it were right behind me, just inches away. I reached the ground, my legs nearly giving out beneath me, my breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, the flashlight beam weak, flickering, the shadows shifting and twisting in the night. The figure was gone, but the fear remained, a cold, unshakable weight that pressed down on me, that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I started to run, my feet slipping on the gravel, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my own footsteps swallowed by the thumping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tracks stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness, the woods closing in, and I pushed myself faster, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't stop until I reached the road, the light from a distant street lamp barely visible through the trees, a beacon that called to me, promising safety, escape. I stumbled onto the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling, the cold sweat clinging to my skin. I looked back, my eyes scanning the line of the railroad, the woods beyond, but there was nothing there, just darkness, silence, the wind rustling through the trees. The thumping had stopped, the quiet settling back in, but the fear lingered. The memory of those eyes, the sound, the sense of something watching, following. I knew I would never go back to that railroad, never set foot on those tracks again. Some places were meant to be forgotten, abandoned, left to the darkness and the things that lived within it. And as I turned away, the light of the street lamp growing brighter, the warmth of the world creeping back in, I knew one thing for certain. I was lucky to have made it out. Story 24. The cabin was supposed to be an escape, a place to get away from everything. It was nestled deep in the forest, far from the noise of the city, the kind of place where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the crackle of a fire. My brother, Tom, and I had planned this trip for weeks. We both needed a break, and there was nothing better than a few days of fishing, hiking, and forgetting about everything else. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. We pulled up to the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked as I remembered it, small, weathered, with a front porch that creaked under our weight. But the air felt different, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the unease, blaming it on the long drive, and helped Tom unload the truck. "You feel that?" Tom asked as we brought our bags inside. He was standing by the window, looking out at the trees. "Feel what?" I dropped my bag onto one of the bunks, glancing over at him. "I don't know," he said, frowning, "like we're being watched or something." I forced a laugh. "It's just the forest, man. No neighbors for miles. Probably just feels weird because we're not used to it." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There was something about the stillness outside, the way the trees seemed to crowd in, that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. We settled in, got a fire going, and by the time the sun had fully set, I was starting to feel a little better. The warmth of the fire filled the cabin, the light flickering off the wooden walls, and Tom had cracked open a couple of beers, the two of us relaxing for the first time in weeks. We talked, laughed, tried to push away the unease that had followed us here. But as the night wore on, the feeling crept back. It was subtle at first, just a sense that the forest outside had grown quieter. The usual nighttime sounds, the chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves, had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Tom noticed it too. He looked at me, his smile fading, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the window. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "Nothing. That's the problem." We both stood, moving to the window, peering out into the dark. The fire crackled behind us, casting long shadows across the room, but outside there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of the trees, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that we were just spooking ourselves, but the silence was wrong. It felt heavy, like the forest was waiting for something. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it, a low, guttural call, almost like a voice, but twisted, distorted. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at Tom. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head, my mouth dry. "I don't know." The sound came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, a mix between a growl and a moan, something that made my skin crawl. Tom backed away from the window, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "We should leave," he said, his voice trembling. "We should get out of here." I wanted to argue, to tell him we were being ridiculous, but the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. I nodded, turning away from the window, moving toward the door. But before I could reach it, there was a noise from the porch, a creak, like the weight of something heavy stepping onto the wooden boards. Tom and I both froze, our eyes locking. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I reached for the fire poker, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around the cold metal. Another creak, closer this time, followed by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I turned, my eyes darting to the window, and for just a moment, I saw it, a shadow, tall and gaunt, moving past the glass. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky, unnatural. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, the poker clutched tightly in my hands. "We need to go," Tom said again, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with fear. I nodded, moving toward the back door, motioning for Tom to follow. We crept through the small kitchen, the old floorboards creaking under our weight, every sound seeming to echo through the silent cabin. I reached the door, my hand on the knob, when I heard it again, that guttural, twisted call, right outside, followed by the sound of something scratching at the walls. Tom's hand gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging in, and I could feel him trembling. I turned the knob slowly, pulling the door open, the cold night air rushing in. We stepped outside, the world bathed in pale moonlight, the trees standing like silent sentinels around us. I glanced back at the cabin, my heart pounding, and for just a moment I saw it, a face at the window, pale, hollow-eyed, watching us. We ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just ran, my feet pounding against the earth, the cold air burning in my lungs. Tom was right behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the two of us crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes. I could hear it behind us, the heavy thud of its footsteps, the low growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The truck was parked at the edge of the clearing, and I could see it ahead, the faint glint of moonlight off the windshield. I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my chest tight. We reached the truck, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. Tom dove into the passenger seat, and I followed, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and I floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching, the truck lurching forward. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding, and for just a second, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, its head cocked to one side, watching us as we sped away. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the dark shape of the forest disappearing into the distance. The cabin nothing but a memory. Neither of us spoke. The weight of what we'd seen, what we'd barely escaped, hanging heavy between us. I knew, without a doubt, that we had seen something we weren't meant to, something that belonged to the deep, dark parts of the forest, something that had watched us, followed us, and let us go. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not going back, are we?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "No, never." And as we drove away, the cabin far behind us, I knew one thing for certain. Some places were meant to be left alone, and whatever was out there, whatever had watched us from the shadows, was one of those things. It was still there, somewhere in the forest, waiting, watching, and I had no intention of ever giving it another chance to find me.